Long before the name Portugal was ever spoken, before borders were carved on maps and kings raised banners above castles, there was a land kissed by the Atlantic winds, a rugged, fertile strip of the Iberian Peninsula that would one day be called Lusitania. To understand the story of Portugal, we must journey back thousands of years, to a time when myths blurred with memory, when tribes, travelers, and conquerors left footprints on the soil, each shaping the destiny of a nation yet unborn. The story begins with the first inhabitants of this land. Millennia ago, long before the Roman legions marched across Europe, before Christianity spread its gospel, prehistoric peoples settled along the rivers, coasts, and valleys of what we now know as Portugal. They were hunters and gatherers at first, then farmers who cultivated the fertile plains of the Tagus and the Douro. They left behind mysterious monuments of stone, silent guardians of a forgotten age. Dolmens, menhirs, and cromlechs still stand in places like Évora, where the Almendra's cromlech stretches across the earth, whispering secrets of rituals lost to time. These megalithic structures, older even than Stonehenge, tell us that Portugal was not a backwater of Europe, but part of a vibrant prehistoric world of belief, ceremony, and community. Imagine the nights in those times, fires crackling under the starry sky, the sound of drums echoing across the hills, and shadows of worshippers dancing around stones that pointed to the heavens. To those early peoples, the land was sacred. The mountains, rivers, and seas were alive with spirits. They were connected to the cycles of nature, the sowing of crops, the migration of animals, the rising and setting of the sun. Their lives were fragile, yet rich with meaning, rooted in the soil of Lusitania. As centuries passed, waves of new peoples arrived, drawn by the land's abundance and its place on the crossroads of the Atlantic and the Mediterranean. The Iberians, believed to have originated from the eastern Mediterranean, mingled with the Celtic tribes who swept in from Central Europe around the first millennium BCE. Together, they formed the Celtiberians, a fierce, independent people who valued honor, kinship, and courage. They lived in fortified hilltop settlements known as castros, some of which still survive as ruins scattered across the Portuguese countryside. These castros were not merely defensive strongholds, but vibrant communities where artisans forged metal, farmers tended crops, and warriors trained for battle. The Celts left behind more than ruins. They gave Lusitania part of its soul. Music played on bagpipes, dances rooted in ancient festivals, myths of druids and warriors, and a deep reverence for nature. Even today, echoes of this Celtic past linger in northern Portugal, where folk traditions, rhythms, and oral legends preserve the memory of a time before written history. But the Iberian Peninsula, blessed with natural harbors and mineral wealth, did not remain isolated. From across the seas came traders and sailors, the Phoenicians from the Levant, those master mariners of the Mediterranean. They arrived around the first millennium BCE, building coastal settlements, trading goods, and spreading their alphabet. To them, Lusitania was a treasure trove of metals, especially tin and silver. They exchanged glass, cloth, and luxury items for the riches of the land. Their presence was not only economic, but cultural. Through trade, they connected the western edge of Europe to the vast network of civilizations stretching to Mesopotamia and Egypt. After the Phoenicians came the Carthaginians, heirs of that maritime legacy, and then the Greeks, who also sought the wealth of Iberia. Yet these traders never fully conquered the land. They touched the coasts, influenced local societies, and then moved on, leaving fragments of their cultures woven into the Lusitanian tapestry. Among the many tribes of Iberia, one stood out: the Lusitanians, who gave their name to the land. They were fierce, proud warriors who lived primarily in the central regions of modern Portugal. To the Romans, they were both a nuisance and a formidable enemy. The Lusitanians resisted conquest for generations, led by legendary figures like Viriathus, a shepherd-turned-general whose cunning and bravery would one day challenge Rome itself. But that is a story for later. In these earliest days, the Lusitanians were not yet a nation, but a collection of tribes bound by culture, language, and shared struggles. The landscape shaped these people as much as they shaped it. Portugal's geography is a land of contrasts: the lush green hills of the north, the golden plains of the Alentejo, the rugged mountains of the interior, and the endless coastline where the Atlantic crashes against cliffs. This variety gave rise to different ways of life. In the north, agriculture flourished, sustained by rivers and rain. In the south, the land lent itself to herding and the cultivation of olives and vines. Along the coast, fishing provided sustenance, while the sea itself beckoned the imagination, promising both danger and opportunity. As centuries flowed like rivers into the sea, the region became a meeting ground of civilizations. Every wave of migration, every contact with foreign traders added new layers to its identity. The people of Lusitania learned to adapt, to absorb influences, and to survive. They were not isolated. They were part of a larger story of Europe and the Mediterranean. Yet they also developed a sense of uniqueness, shaped by their land and struggles. Picture a child in a Lusitanian village around 500 BCE. He grows up hearing tales of gods who dwell in rivers and forests. He learns to wield a spear, to herd animals, and to dance at festivals celebrating the harvest. His family trades with distant sailors who speak strange tongues and bring colorful fabrics. In his lifetime, he may see Phoenician ships sail along the coast, Greek coins exchanged in the markets, and rumors of new threats from the east. The rising power of Rome. What defined these early centuries was resilience. The people of Lusitania endured hardship raids, droughts, rivalries, but they endured together. They wove a fabric of culture that was both diverse and rooted, fragile yet enduring. And though they could not know it then, they were laying the foundations of a nation that centuries later would command the seas of the world. In the silent stones of megaliths, in the ruins of castros, in the myths whispered by rivers and mountains, we can still sense the spirit of those early days. It is the dawn before the storm, the opening chapter of a long saga. The land that would become Portugal was already alive, already shaping its people with trials, gifts, and dreams. This is Lusitania before Portugal, a land of warriors and farmers, of traders and storytellers, of stone circles and sacred rivers, a land waiting for its destiny. Soon, the legions of Rome would arrive, and with them, conquest, blood, and transformation. But in this dawn, before the clash of empires, we see the roots of a people stubborn, resilient, bound to their land. And from those roots, the story of Portugal begins. When the dawn of Lusitania still shimmered with the glow of its tribal fires, a storm was gathering in the east. It was the march of Rome, relentless, disciplined, hungry for conquest. By the 3rd century BCE, the Roman Republic had already cast its shadow across much of the Mediterranean. Carthage had been humbled, Greece subdued, and Gaul trembled beneath Roman sandals. And now, the Iberian Peninsula, rich in resources, fertile in land, and vital in strategy, became Rome's next obsession. For the people of Lusitania, the arrival of Rome was not a single event, but a long and brutal process. The first Roman incursions into Iberia came during the Punic Wars, when Rome and Carthage fought for dominance. The peninsula, with its ports and silver mines, was a prize worth any sacrifice. Carthaginian generals like Hannibal had marched their armies across Iberia, recruiting local tribes as allies. Rome could not allow such a foothold to remain. Thus began nearly 2 centuries of struggle to bring Iberia under Roman control. At first, the Lusitanians, those fierce tribes of central Portugal, were little more than an annoyance to Rome. But soon, they became a symbol of resistance. The Romans underestimated them. These were no simple villagers. They were skilled in guerrilla warfare, intimately familiar with the rugged terrain of their homeland. From the mountains, they struck like lightning, ambushing Roman columns, disappearing into forests, attacking supply lines, and vanishing into the night. Out of this defiance rose one of history's great heroes, Viriathus. Viriathus was no noble by birth. He was said to be a shepherd, a man of the people. But in times of war, destiny often calls the humble to greatness. Around 147 BCE, he became the leader of the Lusitanian resistance, and under his command, the tribes inflicted humiliating defeats upon Rome. His tactics, swift strikes, ambushes, sudden retreats, confounded the legions, trained for open battle on flat fields. Rome, accustomed to breaking kings and empires, found itself outmaneuvered by a shepherd. For nearly a decade, Viriathus held Rome at bay. His victories became legend, not only among his own people, but across Iberia. Other tribes looked to him as a symbol of hope, a proof that Rome could bleed. The Senate in Rome grew restless. Generals sent to Lusitania returned in shame. It is said that the Romans even attempted treaties, only to break them when convenient. Yet Viriathus stood firm, a thorn in the side of an empire that prided itself on inevitability. But Rome was patient, and Rome was ruthless. Unable to defeat Viriathus in battle, the Romans turned to treachery. They bribed his closest companions, who murdered him as he slept. When the killers returned for their reward, the Roman general Servilius Caepio dismissed them coldly. Rome does not pay traitors. Thus died Viriathus, betrayed not by his enemies, but by his friends. With his death, Lusitanian resistance began to crumble. By the dawn of the 1st century BCE, Lusitania was drawn firmly into the Roman orbit. Fortresses rose, roads stretched across valleys, and Roman law stamped its authority over the land. Yet conquest was never absolute. Even as Rome imposed its will, the Lusitanian spirit endured, woven into the fabric of a new identity. What did Rome bring to Lusitania? Much more than conquest. Rome reshaped the land itself. Cities were founded or expanded. Olisipo, modern Lisbon; Emerita Augusta, Merida in modern Spain, but once the capital of Lusitania; and Bracara Augusta, Braga. Aqueducts carried water. Amphitheaters echoed with cheers. Temples rose to Jupiter and Mars. Roman engineers carved their mark into stone and earth, binding the territory into their vast empire. Trade flourished under Roman rule. The Tagus River carried goods from the interior to the sea, while the Atlantic coast connected Lusitania to faraway provinces. Olive oil, wine, salt, and precious metals became staples of Roman commerce. Lusitanian horses, famed for their speed and strength, were prized across the empire. What had once been a remote frontier was now an integral part of Rome's global machine. But Rome's greatest conquest was not material. It was cultural. Latin spread across the land, slowly blending with native tongues. Laws, customs, and traditions were Romanized, though always with a Lusitanian flavor. Over centuries, the language evolved into something distinct. What we now call Portuguese would one day spring from this fusion. Roman religion also left its mark, though often merging with local deities. Inscriptions still found today show the names of gods who were half Roman, half Lusitanian, evidence of a cultural dialogue rather than simple domination. And yet beneath this veneer of Roman order, tension simmered. The Lusitanian spirit, forged in resistance, did not vanish. It adapted. Families still told tales of Viriathus, whispered around fires. Festivals still carried echoes of Celtic and Iberian rituals. Even as citizens of Rome, the people of Lusitania remained distinct stubbornly themselves. The centuries rolled on. By the time of Emperor Augustus, Lusitania was fully integrated into the Roman Empire, governed as a province with Merida as its capital. Roads connected it to the empire's vast network, making travel and communication easier than ever. A villager in Braga could, at least in theory, follow Roman roads all the way to Rome itself. Roman law provided order, Roman soldiers provided security, and Roman culture provided prestige. To be Roman was to be part of something larger than tribe or village. It was to belong to an empire that stretched from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Yet the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was never absolute. On the fringes, rebellions flared, bandits roamed the hills. And as centuries passed, Rome itself began to weaken. Corruption, economic strain, and pressures from invading tribes strained the empire. Lusitania, once the prize of conquest, became a backwater province, distant from the drama of Rome, but never entirely free from its fate. Still, the Roman centuries left a legacy that would never fade. The language, the cities, the laws, all these survived the fall of Rome. When we walk today through the ruins of Conimbriga, with its mosaics and villas, we are stepping into that Roman shadow. The people who lived there dined in atriums, debated in forums, prayed in temples, and dreamed Roman dreams, even as their blood carried the memory of Celt and Lusitanian ancestors. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had begun to spread across the empire, reaching Lusitania as well. At first persecuted, the faith grew in strength, offering hope in uncertain times. Roman temples gave way to Christian churches, and the old gods retreated into myth. This quiet transformation would shape the spiritual heart of Portugal for centuries to come. As the empire faltered, new storms gathered. Beyond the Rhine and the Danube, barbarian tribes pressed against Rome's borders. The Visigoths, Vandals, and Suebi moved westward, seeking new lands. The Roman legions, once invincible, struggled to hold them back. In 476 CE, Rome itself fell, and though the empire lingered in the east, the western provinces were left adrift. Lusitania, too, was abandoned to its fate. The proud Roman cities crumbled, their forums silent, their baths dry. Roads fell into disrepair, aqueducts broke, and amphitheaters became ruins. The order Rome had imposed dissolved, leaving behind fragments of civilization, ghosts of grandeur. But even in decline, Rome's shadow remained. The people of Lusitania were no longer the wild tribes of Viriathus's age. They were heirs to centuries of Roman law, Roman architecture, Roman faith. They had become something new, not entirely Roman, not entirely Celt, but a fusion, a people who would survive the chaos of the coming centuries. And so, as the 5th century dawned, the land that would become Portugal stood at another crossroads. Rome had come, conquered, and departed. The Visigoths and Suebi approached, bringing a new order, a new chapter in the saga. The Roman shadow would never fully disappear, but the stage was set for another transformation, another struggle for identity. From shepherd warriors to Roman citizens, the Lusitanians had endured. The seeds of Portugal had been sown in Roman soil. What came next would test their resilience once more. When the Roman Empire collapsed in the west, it did not vanish in a single instant like a city consumed by fire. Instead, it crumbled gradually, like an old statue weathered by centuries of wind and rain, until at last the cracks could no longer be hidden. And when it fell, the pieces scattered across Europe, giving rise to new kingdoms, new identities, and new struggles. In Lusitania, the land that would one day become Portugal, the fall of Rome opened the gates to a time of turbulence and transformation. The 5th century dawned with uncertainty. The aqueducts still stood, the roads still stretched across valleys, the villas still gleamed with mosaics, but the legions were gone. Rome no longer sent soldiers to guard the frontier or governors to enforce law. In their place came waves of new peoples, drawn westward by the vacuum of power. Vandals, Alans, Suebi, and Visigoths. Each tribe carved its claim upon Iberian soil, leaving scars that would shape the destiny of the land. The Suebi, a Germanic tribe, were among the first to stake their presence in the northwest of Iberia. Around 409 CE, they swept into the region, establishing a kingdom that stretched across Galicia and northern Portugal. Their capital was set in Braga, and for the first time, the city became the center of a new political order, not Roman, but Germanic. The Suebi brought their own customs, their own warriors, their own gods, though many soon converted to Christianity, which was already spreading through Iberia. Life under the Suebi was a mixture of continuity and disruption. On one hand, the Romanized inhabitants of Lusitania, farmers, artisans, landowners, continued their daily lives. The fields were still tilled, the vineyards tended, the markets held. On the other hand, the sense of unity that Rome had imposed dissolved. Authority was fragmented, roads less secure, and the once mighty Roman cities slipped into neglect. The Suebi were not builders of aqueducts or engineers of grand forums. Their rule was more tribal, more decentralized. Still, they endured for nearly 2 centuries, the first kingdom to arise in the lands that would later shape Portugal. But the Suebi were not destined to last forever. To the east, another power grew stronger, the Visigoths. Originally wanderers who had crossed the Roman world, plundering and settling in turn, the Visigoths had carved out a kingdom centered in Toledo. By the late 6th century, they turned their eyes to the Suebi lands. In 585 CE, under King Leovigild, the Visigoths conquered the Suebi, absorbing their kingdom into a larger Visigothic realm. And so Lusitania, once Roman, then Suebic, became Visigothic. The Visigothic period, stretching from the 6th to the early 8th century, was one of paradox. In some ways, it was a dark age, a time of political instability, weak economy, and frequent civil wars. In other ways, it was a time of quiet foundations, when the seeds of medieval Portugal began to take root. The Visigoths, though Germanic by origin, had long been influenced by Rome. They adopted Roman law, Roman administrative structures, and above all, the Latin language, which was already evolving into the early forms of Portuguese. Their kings ruled as successors not of tribal chieftains, but of Roman emperors, cloaking themselves in the prestige of the fallen empire. They sought legitimacy through religion as well, and by the late 6th century, the Visigoths officially embraced Catholic Christianity, abandoning their earlier Arian beliefs. This shift was profound. It united the Visigothic rulers with the Hispano-Roman majority under a single faith, binding Iberia in a common religious identity that would endure long after the Visigoths themselves had disappeared. Religion became the glue of the kingdom. Councils were held in Toledo, where bishops and kings debated laws, doctrine, and governance. The church grew in power, shaping not only spiritual life but also political affairs. Monasteries were founded, preserving manuscripts and knowledge through the chaos. It was in this crucible of faith and fragile stability that Iberia's Christian identity was forged, a faith that would later define the Reconquista and the very soul of Portugal. Yet for all this, the Visigothic kingdom was far from stable. Power passed not by inheritance, but by election among the nobles, leading to endless rivalries and assassinations. Kings rose and fell with alarming frequency, each reign often shorter than the last. The nobility wielded enormous influence, fracturing the kingdom with their ambitions. The Visigoths, never numerous, ruled over a vast population of Hispano-Romans, often struggling to maintain unity. In Lusitania, life was marked by both continuity and decline. Roman cities like Merida, still the provincial capital, retained importance as religious and administrative centers. Braga, though diminished from its Roman splendor, remained significant as a hub of Christian faith. But outside the cities, the countryside grew more fragmented. Villas decayed, roads crumbled, and long-distance trade weakened. The great Roman networks had dissolved, leaving communities more isolated, more inward-looking. Still, even in decline, a cultural fusion was taking place. Roman traditions mingled with Visigothic customs. Local laws blended with Gothic codes. The architecture of churches began to shift, incorporating new styles. Folk tradition songs, dances, stories evolved in this melting pot of influences. Out of such mixtures, a distinct Iberian character was forming, one that carried the memory of Rome, the imprint of the Celts, and the shadow of the Goths. But history rarely rests. By the early 8th century, the Visigothic kingdom was faltering. Civil wars weakened its core, rival claimants fought for the throne, and the once proud realm was fractured. In 711 CE, a storm unlike any before swept across the straits from North Africa. Muslim armies, swift and determined, crossed into Iberia, and within a few years, the Visigothic kingdom collapsed. At the Battle of Guadalete, King Roderick fell, and with him fell centuries of Visigothic rule. For Lusitania, this was another turning point. The Gothic rulers who had once replaced the Suebi and Romans were themselves replaced by a new power, the Moors. A new faith, a new culture, a new age had arrived. The Visigoths left behind traces, laws, churches, traditions, but their time was over. The land of Portugal was once again poised to be transformed. And so the Visigothic centuries, though often overlooked, remain vital in the story of Portugal. They were years of turbulence, but also of transition. They carried forward the Roman legacy, baptized it in Christianity, and handed it to the next conquerors. They preserved enough of the old world to shape the new, enough of Rome to prepare the way for medieval kingdoms, enough of faith to inspire centuries of struggle against future invaders. When we walk today through Braga's ancient churches or study the councils of Toledo, we glimpse the Visigothic hand that once ruled Lusitania. It was a fragile hand, unsteady and brief, but it carried the torch of civilization through a dark age. And though the kingdom would fall to the Moors, its flame would not be extinguished. It would burn quietly, waiting for the day when Christian kingdoms would rise again, and among them, Portugal would take its place. The year was 711. Across the sun-drenched fields of Iberia, the once mighty Visigothic kingdom had grown fragile, riven by civil strife and weakened by decades of internal quarrels. In that year, a tide swept across the narrow waters of the Strait of Gibraltar swift, unexpected, unstoppable. From North Africa came the Moors, Muslim warriors of Arab and Berber descent, carrying not only the sword, but also a new faith, a new language, and a new vision of civilization. For Lusitania, the land that would one day be Portugal, this invasion marked the beginning of an age unlike any before. The Romans had left roads, laws, and Latin. The Visigoths had carried forward Christianity and fragile unity. But the Moors brought a cultural transformation so profound that even centuries after their rule ended, echoes of Al-Andalus still resonate in Portugal's soul. It began at the Battle of Guadalete, where King Roderick, last of the Visigothic monarchs, fell before the forces of Tariq ibn Ziyad. Legend tells us that Tariq landed with his men near the great rock that still bears his name, Gibraltar, Jabal Tariq, the Mountain of Tariq. With the Visigothic armies shattered, the Moors advanced swiftly across Iberia. Within a few short years, most of the peninsula lay under their control. Lusitania did not resist long. The cities, weary of Visigothic instability, often opened their gates to the new rulers. Merida, Lisbon, Coimbra, one by one they fell. For the people, the arrival of the Moors was not merely conquest, but a shift in daily life. New rulers, new taxes, new laws, but also new opportunities. For the Moors were not destroyers, they were builders. The land became part of Al-Andalus, the Muslim-ruled territories of Iberia. At first, it was a frontier, a borderland between the heart of Moorish power in Córdoba and the wild Christian north. Over time, Lusitania absorbed the rhythms of its new masters. Arabic words seeped into daily speech. Fields blossomed with new crops introduced from the east, citrus fruits, rice, sugarcane. The terraces of the Algarve bloomed with orchards that turned barren hillsides into gardens. Irrigation techniques, far more advanced than those left by Rome, brought water to fields and made agriculture flourish. Life under Moorish rule was complex, and it varied greatly depending on time and place. Christians and Jews were allowed to continue their faiths, though as dhimmis they paid special taxes. Some converted to Islam, drawn by the promise of social mobility and favor. Others remained steadfast in their traditions, creating a mosaic of faiths. In towns and cities, the mingling of cultures gave birth to something unique, a fusion of Arabic, Latin, Hebrew, and local traditions that would shape Iberian identity. The cities flourished. Lisbon, known as Al-Ushbuna, grew as a port, a gateway to trade with distant lands. Silves rose to prominence in the Algarve, its walls and markets humming with life. Coimbra, perched on the Mondego River, became a frontier city where cultures clashed and blended. In these towns, the call to prayer echoed from minarets, markets bustled with goods from Africa and the East, and scholars studied the Quran, philosophy, and science. To walk through a Moorish city in Lusitania was to step into a world of color and sound. Narrow, winding streets led to bustling souks where spices, silks, and ceramics filled the air with fragrance and light. Water trickled through fountains and courtyards, shaded by orange trees. Architecture blossomed with arches, geometric patterns, and tiles azulejos that would later become one of Portugal's most distinctive artistic legacies. The Moors brought not just power, but an aesthetic, a way of life rooted in beauty, order, and harmony. Yet Lusitania was not only a land of peace and prosperity, it was also a frontier of war. To the north, small Christian enclaves resisted, retreating into the mountains of Asturias and Galicia. From there, they launched raids and dreamed of reconquest. For centuries, the line between Al-Andalus and the Christian north shifted like a tide, advancing and retreating with every battle. Lusitania, lying along this shifting frontier, knew both the stability of Moorish governance and the terror of war. The people themselves adapted as they always had. A farmer in the Tagus Valley might speak Latin at home, Arabic in the market, and hear Hebrew in the synagogue. A Christian craftsman might carve wood for a mosque, while a Muslim trader might sell his wares to a Jewish scholar. In this mingling lay the seeds of something extraordinary, a hybrid culture that carried forward knowledge from Greece, Rome, Persia, and the Arab world. For the Moors were not only conquerors, they were custodians of knowledge. In Córdoba, Seville, and Toledo, scholars translated Aristotle and Plato into Arabic, preserved the works of Galen and Ptolemy, and advanced mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Though Lusitania lay at the edge of this intellectual flowering, the influence reached its towns. Algebra, the astrolabe, medical texts, these were gifts of Al-Andalus carried through trade and teaching that enriched Iberia as a whole. Still, no rule lasts forever. By the 10th century, cracks appeared within Al-Andalus itself. The once powerful caliphate of Córdoba fragmented into smaller kingdoms, or taifas. Some of these taifas ruled over Portuguese lands, such as the taifa of Badajoz, which extended influence into Lisbon and the Alentejo. Fragmentation brought vulnerability, and Christian kingdoms in the north began pressing southward with renewed vigor. The Reconquista, the long, slow struggle to reclaim Iberia for Christianity, had begun almost as soon as the Moors arrived, but in these centuries, it gathered strength. For Lusitania, this meant its towns and castles became prizes in a relentless tug-of-war. Lisbon, Coimbra, and Santarem changed hands multiple times. Each conquest was followed by reconquest, each victory by counterattack. The land knew little lasting peace, but it knew resilience, for the people had learned to live between two worlds. By the 11th century, the Christian push southward was undeniable. Northern lords, aided by knights from across Europe, pressed into central Portugal. The Moors resisted fiercely, fortifying castles and calling upon allies from North Africa. Battles raged across the Tagus Valley, leaving fields scarred, cities burned, and populations displaced. Yet out of this struggle, Portugal would one day be born. The Moorish legacy, however, could not be erased by the sword. Even as Christian forces advanced, they absorbed Moorish innovations. Agriculture, architecture, language, and art, these endured, woven into the fabric of Portugal. Even today, Portuguese words of Arabic origin remind us of that age. Azeite, olive oil, alface, lettuce, açúcar, sugar. Place names like Algarve and Alcácer echo their Moorish past. The very soul of Portuguese culture carries Moorish traces in music, in food, in architecture, in memory. For nearly 5 centuries, Lusitania lived under the shadow of Al-Andalus. It was an age of conquest and coexistence, of beauty and brutality, of tolerance and conflict. The Moors left behind not only ruins of castles and mosques, but a heritage of knowledge and creativity that enriched Europe itself. Without Al-Andalus, the Renaissance might never have come, for it was through these lands that ancient wisdom reached Christian Europe again. And so, as the 11th century closed and the 12th century dawned, the tides of history shifted once more. Christian banners began to rise over castles that had long flown the crescent. Out of the struggle between cross and crescent, a new nation was stirring in the west. Portugal, though not yet fully born, was already breathing. The Moorish age had transformed Lusitania, leaving marks that would never fade. Even as Christian knights marched southward, even as Lisbon and Santarem fell into Christian hands, the legacy of Al-Andalus endured in language, in stone, in song. The story of Portugal could not be told without it, for in this land where Romans had ruled, where Goths had faltered, where Moors had flourished, destiny was preparing its next chapter, the birth of a kingdom called Portugal. By the dawn of the 12th century, Iberia was a chessboard of faiths and powers. To the south, the Moors still held vast territories, their minarets and fortresses standing as symbols of Al-Andalus. To the north, Christian kingdoms Castile, Leon, Navarre, and Aragon expanded steadily, reclaiming land bit by bit in the centuries-long struggle of the Reconquista. Amid this clash of civilizations, in a strip of land by the Atlantic, a new nation stirred, one that would soon proclaim itself Portugal. The roots of this kingdom lay in a gift and a marriage. In 1096, King Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile granted his daughter Teresa the county of Portugal as a dowry when she wed Henry of Burgundy, a French nobleman who had come to Iberia to fight the Moors. This territory, known as the Condado Portucalense, stretched around Porto and Coimbra, a frontier land on the edge of Christendom. Henry of Burgundy ruled it as a vassal of Leon, but with ambition in his heart and independence in his gaze. Henry died young in 1112, leaving his widow Teresa to govern. She was a strong woman, shrewd and determined, but her ties with Galicia and her alliances made many in Portugal uneasy. The nobility longed for autonomy, a destiny apart from Leon. In this tension grew a young boy Henry's son, Afonso Henriques. Afonso was raised in the turbulent world of frontier politics, where loyalty shifted with the tides of war. From his earliest years, he was shaped not by peace, but by struggle, against the Moors, against rival Christian lords, and even against his own mother. Legend paints him as bold, restless, impatient with submission. His education, partly under the tutelage of Bishop Egas Moniz, instilled both faith and the art of leadership. By his teens, Afonso was already commanding men in battle. The defining moment came in 1128 at the Battle of São Mamede near Guimarães. Afonso, still a young man, turned his army against the forces of his mother Teresa, who had allied with the powerful Galician nobleman Fernando Pérez de Trava. In a clash that was as much family feud as political struggle, Afonso's forces triumphed. Teresa was exiled, and Afonso Henriques emerged as the uncontested leader of Portugal. From that moment, Guimarães would forever be remembered as the cradle of the Portuguese nation, but victory over his mother was only the beginning. Afonso Henriques had greater ambitions: independence. For decades, the county of Portugal had been bound to León as a vassal. Afonso, however, dreamed of sovereignty. He pressed southward against the Moors, capturing lands and fortresses. His campaigns were not only acts of conquest, but declarations of intent. Portugal was not merely a county, it was becoming a kingdom. In 1139, destiny came to him on the battlefield. At the Battle of Urique, deep in Moorish territory, Afonso's outnumbered army faced overwhelming odds. Chroniclers tell us that on the eve of battle, Afonso received a vision of Christ promising victory. Whether miracle or legend, the result was clear. Afonso triumphed. In the aftermath, his soldiers hailed him as King Rei de Portugal. The proclamation of kingship at Urique was more than symbolism. It was a turning point, a declaration that Portugal existed not as a vassal, but as a sovereign realm. Afonso now styled himself Afonso I, King of Portugal, but recognition from neighboring powers would take time. León resisted the idea of losing its western frontier, while the Pope, arbiter of legitimacy in medieval Europe, had yet to give his blessing. For years, Afonso waged war on multiple fronts, against the Moors to the south, against León to the east. He built alliances, married strategically, and sought papal favor. In 1143, at the Treaty of Zamora, Afonso negotiated with his cousin Alfonso VII of León, who begrudgingly recognized Portugal's autonomy. This was a crucial step. Portugal had taken its place among the realms of Iberia. Yet the final seal came in 1179, when Pope Alexander III issued the papal bull Manifestus Probatum, formally acknowledging Afonso as King of Portugal and his kingdom as a vassal directly of the Church, not of León. The dream was complete. Portugal was a nation. Afonso's reign was long and filled with struggle. He spent much of his life in battle, carving out the frontiers of his kingdom. From the Minho River in the north to the Tagus River in the center, he secured Portuguese control. Lisbon, a jewel of Moorish Lusitania, fell to the Portuguese in 1147 with the aid of crusaders from northern Europe. The capture of Lisbon was not only a military triumph, but a cultural milestone. The city, which would one day become Portugal's capital, was now Christian once more. Its mosques became churches, its markets revived under new rule, and its harbor opened to the growing maritime ambitions of Portugal. Life in the new kingdom was both harsh and hopeful. The land was still scarred by war, and rebuilding took time. Villages rose near newly conquered fortresses, fields were cleared, and churches built. The church played a vital role in consolidating power, blessing the crown, and guiding the faithful. Monasteries expanded, preserving learning and cultivating lands. Knights, many inspired by crusading zeal, became guardians of the frontier, their castles dotting the landscape. Yet Portugal was not only forged in war, it was forged in identity. The people who lived there, descendants of Lusitanians, Romans, Goths, and Moors, were now bound together under a single crown. Their loyalty was not to León nor to Al-Andalus, but to Portugal. Afonso Henriques gave them a banner, a language, a destiny. As the 12th century drew to a close, Afonso grew old. His body, once strong, bore the scars of countless battles. In his final years, he watched as his kingdom stood secure, its borders defended, its name respected. When he died in 1185, he left behind more than land or titles. He left behind a nation. Portugal, once a mere county on the edge of Christendom, was now a kingdom in its own right, ready to take its place in the story of Europe. The legacy of Afonso Henriques endures in every stone of Guimarães, in every echo of Lisbon's harbor, in every line of Portugal's history. He was the founder, the warrior king, the dreamer who refused to bow. From the ashes of empire and the chaos of conquest, he carved a nation, and with him, Portugal was born. When Afonso Henriques secured Portugal's independence and claimed Lisbon for his crown, the kingdom was still young, its borders fragile, its people hardened by centuries of war. Yet the dream of Portugal was not only survival, it was expansion. In the 12th and 13th centuries, the kingdom pressed southward, carried on the wave of the Reconquista, that centuries-long crusade to reclaim Iberia from Moorish rule. Portugal's fate, its character, and even its soul were forged in this relentless struggle. The Reconquista was more than a series of battles. It was an epic of endurance. Christian knights rode under banners marked with the cross, believing themselves chosen instruments of God. Moorish warriors defended their fortresses with equal conviction, heirs of a civilization that had turned Iberia into a jewel of knowledge and beauty. Between them stretched a frontier, a line of castles, rivers, and fields that shifted with every campaign. Portugal, the westernmost of the Christian kingdoms, was destined to push this line to the sea. In 1147, Lisbon had fallen to Afonso Henriques and his allies, a victory that gave Portugal a capital and a gateway to the Atlantic. But the land south of the Tagus remained Moorish. The valleys of the Alentejo and the orchards of the Algarve were still part of Al-Andalus, defended by fortresses at Santarém, Évora, Beja, Silves, and Faro. To conquer these lands would take generations. The 12th century saw a steady rhythm of war and resettlement. Knights of the Templars and the Order of St. John monastic warriors sworn to poverty and battle came to Portugal, granted lands in return for their service. They built castles on the frontier, Tomar, Almorol, Pombal, and others, fortresses that still stand as silent witnesses to those violent times. Each stone laid was both defense and proclamation. This is Christian land. This is Portugal. Life along the frontier was perilous but alive with opportunity. Farmers cleared fields abandoned during war, shepherds grazed flocks under the watch of castles, and traders carried goods between Christian and Moorish lands. The frontier was not only a place of conflict, but of exchange. Languages mingled, customs overlapped, and even in battle, the cultures could not help but influence one another. The architecture of Portuguese castles borrowed Moorish forms, while Christian farmers adopted irrigation systems perfected by Muslim engineers. The campaigns continued under Afonso's successors. His son, Sancho I, known as the Populator, encouraged settlers to move into newly conquered lands, granting them privileges to cultivate and defend the frontier. Town charters forae were issued, giving rights to inhabitants and binding them to the crown. In this way, the land was not only taken by the sword, but secured by community. By the early 13th century, the Reconquista in Portugal gained momentum. King Afonso II and then King Sancho II pressed deeper into the Alentejo. In 1234, Évora, a city of immense strategic importance, fell to the Christians. Beja and Serpa followed. Each conquest was not only a military victory, but a spiritual triumph, celebrated by processions and the dedication of mosques as churches. But it was under King Afonso III that the great prize was taken. In 1249, the Algarve, the southernmost region of Portugal, was conquered. The capture of Faro marked the completion of Portugal's Reconquista. At last, from the Minho River in the north to the Algarve coast in the south, the kingdom stretched across its modern boundaries. Unlike Castile or Aragon, which still faced centuries of conflict before expelling the Moors from Granada in 1492, Portugal had completed its territorial formation by the mid-13th century. This gave it a unique advantage. While others were still consumed by the Reconquista, Portugal could turn its gaze outward to the sea. Yet the victory was not without cost. The wars had drained resources and lives. Cities had to be rebuilt, lands resettled, justice imposed in territories long divided by faith. Still, the Portuguese crown proved resilient. The church stood as an ally, sanctifying conquest and helping to organize society. The military orders, rewarded with lands, became powerful lords of the frontier. Their castles, rising from the hills of Alentejo, were symbols of both devotion and authority. The Reconquista also forged Portugal's identity. It was in the crucible of war against the Moors that the Portuguese people came to see themselves as a distinct nation, united by faith, language, and loyalty to the crown. Their kings were not distant figures, but leaders who fought beside them, bled with them, and promised protection. The cross of Christ and the shield of Portugal became intertwined, inseparable. At the same time, the Reconquista left a complex legacy. Many Muslims remained in Portugal after conquest, living as mudajars permitted to keep their faith in return for taxes. Their skills in farming, building, and crafts were vital to the kingdom. Jews too played an essential role, serving as traders, financiers, and scholars. Portugal, though Christian, was never purely homogeneous. It was, from its beginning, a mosaic of peoples whose coexistence, though sometimes uneasy, enriched the realm. Culturally, the Reconquista shaped Portugal's soul. The castles and cathedrals that still dominate the landscape rose during these centuries. Romanesque churches gave way to early Gothic cathedrals, their stone walls proclaiming the triumph of Christendom. The epic songs of troubadours celebrated knightly valor and courtly love, echoing both Christian and Moorish traditions. In poetry and music, the longing and melancholy born of frontier life found expression, a sensibility that centuries later would blossom into fado, the mournful song of Portugal. By the mid-13th century, with the Algarve secured, Portugal stood as one of the most stable realms of Iberia. Its borders, remarkably, would remain almost unchanged to this very day. While neighbors continued their wars, Portugal consolidated its rule, organized its administration, and nurtured its people. It was no longer merely a child of the Reconquista. It was a nation ready to look beyond the battlefield. The sea, always present along Portugal's long coast, beckoned. Fishermen had long ventured into the Atlantic, sailors navigated to distant shores, and merchants traded along the coast. With peace at home, the kingdom's energy would soon turn outward, toward horizons unknown. The Reconquista had forged Portugal's courage, discipline, and unity. The ocean would offer it destiny. But that moment had not yet come. In the 13th century, Portugal was still savoring the hard-won fruits of conquest. The banners of the crescent had fallen. The cross of Christ now flew over castles from Coimbra to Faro. The kingdom, secure in its borders, began to cultivate not only land, but legacy. The Reconquista was over, but the story of Portugal had only just begun. By the middle of the 13th century, Portugal stood at a remarkable crossroads. Unlike its neighbors in Iberia, who still wrestled with the Moors in Andalusia, Portugal had already achieved what seemed impossible. It had defined its borders, conquered its lands, and completed its Reconquista. From the verdant valleys of the Minho to the golden shores of the Algarve, the kingdom stretched across its modern shape. This was no longer a frontier county fighting for survival. This was a realm with the security to look inward, to build the foundations of a lasting kingdom. The century after the conquest of the Algarve was not marked by great battles or dramatic invasions, but by something subtler, perhaps more profound: the slow weaving of governance, culture, and identity into a coherent whole. If the Reconquista had been the furnace that forged Portugal's sword, the 13th century was the anvil upon which the blade was sharpened and given its enduring form. A kingdom consolidated. The first challenge was governance. Conquest had left behind a patchwork of lands, peoples, and traditions. Portuguese kings now needed to impose order over territories newly reclaimed from the Moors, while ensuring loyalty from restless nobles and military orders. To achieve this, they turned to law. Charters forae were granted to towns across the kingdom, codifying their rights, obligations, and privileges. These documents were more than legal contracts. They were symbols of belonging. A town with a royal charter was not just a collection of houses and fields. It was part of the kingdom, bound directly to the crown. Castles rose as guardians of these communities, but equally important were the churches and cathedrals. The church, already powerful in Portugal, grew even stronger in this century. Bishops advised kings, monasteries cultivated lands, and clerics recorded the chronicles that preserved Portugal's memory. The alliance between crown and church was essential. It sanctified the monarchy, provided education, and helped integrate diverse populations under one faith, kings and identity. Among the monarchs of this era, King Afonso III and his son King Dinis I stand out as architects of Portugal's consolidation. Afonso III, who reigned from 1248 to 1279, completed the conquest of the Algarve, giving Portugal its modern borders. But beyond war, he strengthened royal authority by curbing the excessive power of nobles and bringing the Algarve firmly under crown control. He also moved the royal court permanently to Lisbon, recognizing its centrality as a political and economic hub. Yet it was his son, Dinis I, who truly earned the title the Farmer King. Reigning from 1279 to 1325, Dinis was less a warrior than a builder. He understood that the strength of a kingdom lay not only in swords, but in soil, language, and law. Under his guidance, agriculture flourished. He encouraged the planting of forests. The famous Liria pine forest, planted by royal decree, still stands today as a testament to his foresight. These trees provided timber for ships, foreshadowing Portugal's future as a maritime power. Dinis also fostered learning. In 1290, he founded the University of Coimbra, one of the oldest universities in Europe, which became a beacon of scholarship. He codified Portuguese law, organizing scattered customs into coherent statutes. Most significantly, he promoted the Portuguese language itself. At a time when Latin dominated official life, Dinis decreed that Portuguese would be the language of law and administration. In this act, he gave his people not just governance, but identity, a shared tongue that bound them together as a nation, society, and culture. The 13th century was also a period of cultural flowering. Troubadours sang in courts, weaving tales of chivalry and love that echoed both Christian and Moorish traditions. Poetry in Galician Portuguese became one of the richest literary traditions of medieval Europe, celebrated for its lyrical beauty. Music, too, carried the rhythms of the land, blending influences from north and south, east and west. In towns and villages, daily life stabilized. Farmers cultivated wheat, olives, and vines. Craftsmen filled markets with pottery, textiles, and tools. Merchants carried salt, fish, and wine to trade across Iberia and beyond. The sea, always present, grew more central to Portuguese life. Fishing communities thrived along the Atlantic coast, while Lisbon's port connected the kingdom to distant lands. The seeds of Portugal's maritime destiny were being quietly sown in the nets of fishermen and the sails of traders. At the same time, Portuguese society remained a mosaic. Christians were the majority, but Muslims and Jews still lived in the kingdom. Muslims, now subjects of a Christian crown, were known as mudajars and often worked as skilled farmers, builders, and artisans. Jews played vital roles as financiers, physicians, and scholars. This coexistence was not always harmonious, but it enriched Portugal's culture and economy, embedding diversity into the nation's character. Challenges and conflicts. Consolidation, however, was not without conflict. Nobles often resisted royal authority, guarding their privileges fiercely. The military orders, granted vast lands during the Reconquista, sometimes acted as powers unto themselves. The church, while an ally, also demanded autonomy and wealth. Kings had to balance these forces, using diplomacy, law, and occasionally war to maintain control. Externally, Portugal faced pressures from neighboring Castile. Border disputes flared, and alliances shifted with marriages and treaties. Yet Portugal, by the end of the 13th century, had secured recognition of its independence and maintained its territorial integrity. No small feat in the turbulent politics of medieval Iberia, the soul of a nation. What emerged from the 13th century was not merely a kingdom of borders and laws, but a kingdom of identity. Portugal was no longer a fragile frontier state. It was a realm with a language, a culture, a university, and a capital. Its kings were not simply warriors, but lawgivers and patrons of learning. Its people, though diverse, shared a growing sense of belonging to something larger than village or region. They belonged to Portugal. The image of the Portuguese king began to shift. No longer only the knight leading charges against the Moors, he was also the farmer king, the patron of knowledge, the defender of language and law. This broadened vision of kingship would serve Portugal well in the centuries to come, when its ambitions reached beyond Iberia to the very edges of the known world. The stage is set. By the early 14th century, Portugal was secure, stable, and distinct. Its borders were fixed, its institutions solid, its culture vibrant. Other kingdoms of Iberia still wrestled with the Reconquista, but Portugal, having completed its own, could now turn its energies elsewhere. The kingdom was not yet the global empire it would become, but its foundations had been laid. In the forest planted by Dinis, the timber for ships of discovery grew. In the University of Coimbra, scholars preserved knowledge that would guide explorers. In the laws written in Portuguese, a national identity was affirmed. In the bustling port of Lisbon, the future whispered with the sound of waves against the shore. The Reconquista had given Portugal its land. The 13th century gave it its soul. From here, the kingdom would face trials of succession, wars with neighbors, and the challenges of survival in a turbulent medieval world. But it would also look to the sea, and in that horizon lay greatness. Portugal, once a county born of rebellion, was now a kingdom with a destiny. The stage was set for the next chapters of its saga, crisis, resilience, and ultimately expansion into an empire that would stretch across oceans. By the dawn of the 15th century, Portugal was no longer a fragile frontier kingdom. Its borders were secure, its language and culture consolidated, and its kings increasingly confident in their role among Europe's powers. Yet Portugal was smaller in land and population than Castile or France. It had limited resources, a fragile economy, and enemies who could easily overshadow it. To survive, Portugal needed vision. And in this century, that vision would not look inward but outward across the endless expanse of the sea. The Atlantic Ocean had always been Portugal's neighbor, sometimes its threat, always its mystery. Fishermen plied its waters, traders hugged its coasts, but few dared to venture far into its vast, uncharted horizon. To most Europeans, the Atlantic was a boundary, the edge of the known world. But to Portugal, pressed against its waves, the ocean was not a barrier, it was a road. And it was here that Portugal's destiny as a maritime empire began. Prince Henry the Navigator. At the center of this awakening stood one man, Infante Dom Henrique, known to history as Prince Henry the Navigator. Born in 1394, Henry was the son of King John I, the founder of the Avis dynasty, and Philippa of Lancaster, daughter of John of Gaunt of England. From this union came not only a bond between Portugal and England that endures to this day, but also a remarkable generation of princes and princesses known as the Inclita Geração, the illustrious generation. Among them, Henry would shine brightest. Henry was not a sailor himself, nor did he ever circumnavigate the seas he dreamed of. His gift was vision. He saw the ocean not as the end of the world, but as the beginning of possibilities. He understood that Portugal's future lay beyond its shores, in lands uncharted, in waters unexplored. His mind burned with curiosity about Africa, about trade, about the limits of the world itself. In 1415, when Henry was just 21, he joined his father and brothers in the conquest of Ceuta, a Moorish city on the North African coast. This campaign, though brutal, marked a turning point. Ceuta became Portugal's first overseas possession, a gateway to the riches of Africa and the Mediterranean. For Henry, the experience opened his imagination. He glimpsed the caravan routes that brought gold, ivory, and slaves across the Sahara. He realized that Portugal, by turning southward and westward, could bypass the Muslim and Venetian middlemen who controlled trade with the East. After Ceuta, Henry devoted his life to exploration, establishing his base at Sagres, on the windswept promontory of the Algarve. He gathered sailors, cartographers, shipbuilders, and astronomers. Though the image of a grand school of Sagres may be partly legend, there is no doubt that under Henry's patronage, Portugal became the workshop of maritime innovation. Ships, maps, and stars. The Portuguese perfected a new kind of vessel, the caravel. Sleek, fast, and maneuverable, with its lateen sails capable of tacking against the wind, the caravel was a revolution in ship design. Unlike the heavy, cumbersome galleys of the Mediterranean, the caravel could dance with the Atlantic winds, daring to explore beyond sight of land. At the same time, Portuguese cartographers improved maps, blending classical knowledge with fresh discoveries. They learned from Arab navigators, adopting the astrolabe and the compass, instruments that allowed sailors to read the heavens and guide their course across the sea. Slowly, the Atlantic ceased to be a mystery. With every voyage, the coastline of Africa lengthened on maps. The islands of the Atlantic emerged from fog into knowledge. The islands and the ocean. Under Henry's patronage, Portuguese sailors ventured first to the nearby Atlantic islands. In the 1420s, they rediscovered the Madeira Islands, lush with forests and fertile soil. Settlers soon followed, planting wheat and later sugarcane, whose cultivation would foreshadow Portugal's colonial wealth. In the 1430s and 1440s, explorers reached the Azores, a distant archipelago swept by winds but rich in potential. These islands became stepping stones into the Atlantic, bases for ships that would one day cross oceans. But Henry's gaze was not only westward, he was obsessed with the African coast. The great deserts of the Sahara had long hidden a tantalizing rumor. Beyond them lay rivers of gold, kingdoms of wealth. Medieval Europe dreamed of these lands, and Henry sought them with relentless zeal. Portuguese ships sailed south, past Cape Bojador, long feared as the edge of the world, where monsters and boiling seas were said to await. In 1434, the navigator Gil Eanes broke that barrier, proving the fears false and opening the path to further exploration. Trade, faith, and power exploration was never just curiosity. It was commerce, power, and faith intertwined. Portuguese sailors began trading along the African coast, ivory, gold dust, and tragically, human beings. The beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade took root in these ventures, as captives were brought back to Portugal to labor in fields and households. What began as small-scale raids and exchanges would grow into one of the darkest legacies of the Age of Discovery. Yet Henry also saw exploration as a mission of faith. He dreamed of spreading Christianity to distant lands, of finding the legendary Christian king, Prester John, rumored to rule somewhere beyond Africa. Each voyage carried not only merchants, but priests, crosses, as well as compasses. The Reconquista spirit that had forged Portugal on land now carried it across the sea. The legacy of Henry. Prince Henry the Navigator died in 1460, never seeing the full fruits of his vision. Yet by then, his efforts had transformed Portugal. The coasts of Africa were no longer unknown. The islands of the Atlantic were colonized. The art of navigation had advanced beyond what any other European kingdom possessed. Portugal, a small nation pressed against the sea, had set itself on a path that would carry it to the farthest corners of the earth. Henry's legacy was not without shadow. His patronage of exploration also meant the beginning of Portugal's role in the slave trade, a practice that would stain the nation's history for centuries. Yet in his relentless pursuit of discovery, he awakened something in Portugal that could not be extinguished, the belief that destiny lay beyond the horizon. The dawn of an empire. When Henry's eyes closed for the last time, the work was unfinished, but the torch had been lit, and others would carry it forward. His successors, inspired by his vision, would push farther down the coast of Africa, seeking gold, spices, and souls. They would round capes, cross seas, and one day find the passage to India itself. Portugal was no longer just a small kingdom on the edge of Europe. It was the spearpoint of a movement that would reshape the world. The 15th century had opened with a prince's dream, and by its close, Portugal would stand at the dawn of empire. The Age of Discovery had begun, and Portugal stood at its helm. The 15th century was an age of horizons, of maps unfinished and seas untraveled. For Portugal, pressed against the Atlantic, the horizon was not a barrier, but an invitation. Prince Henry the Navigator had planted the seed of exploration, sending caravels south along the African coast, daring sailors to push beyond fear and rumor. When Henry died in 1460, his dream did not die with him. It burned brighter. For his successors, the question was no longer whether the world beyond Africa could be reached. It was when. Portugal's kings, particularly John II and Manuel I, inherited both the ambition and the burden of this quest. They knew that power in Europe was shifting. Castile looked westward, its monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, dreaming of uniting Spain and expanding across the seas. Venice and Genoa controlled the Mediterranean spice trade, their fortunes built on Eastern luxuries. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves transported overland through Muslim and Ottoman hands. Portugal, small and peripheral, could not hope to dominate the continent, but at sea, with ships and daring, it could leap beyond its rivals. The route to the riches of the East, the silks and spices of India, was the holy grail of Portuguese ambition. Bartolomeu Dias and the Stormy Cape. In 1487, King John II entrusted a bold captain, Bartolomeu Dias, with the task of pushing farther south than any had dared before. Portuguese ships had already reached as far as the coast of present-day Angola, but beyond lay the unknown, a vast sweep of coastline bending eastward, perhaps, just perhaps, toward India itself. Dias set sail with 3 ships equipped with the latest navigational instruments and the resilience of Portuguese seamanship. For months, they hugged the coast, mapping, trading, resupplying. Then, somewhere beyond the southern reaches of Africa, storms drove Dias's ships into uncharted waters. For 13 days, gales battered them, pushing them farther and farther south. When at last the skies cleared, Dias turned northward, expecting to see the coast to the west. Instead, he saw it to the east. He had rounded the southern tip of Africa. It was a moment as shocking as it was glorious. For the first time, Europeans had found a way around the continent, a passage into the Indian Ocean. The southern tip of Africa, which Dias named the Cape of Storms, was later renamed by King John II as the Cape of Good Hope, for it offered precisely that, hope that the route to India was within reach. Dias returned to Portugal in 1488, his achievement monumental, yet he had not sailed all the way to India. His men, exhausted and fearful, demanded return. His voyage was both triumph and unfinished promise, but he had shown the way. The oceanic path was open. Vasco da Gama and the route to India. A decade later, under the reign of King Manuel I, the dream would be completed. In 1497, the king entrusted Vasco da Gama, a nobleman of determination and skill, with the greatest voyage yet attempted, to sail from Lisbon to India. On July 8, 1497, da Gama's small fleet of 4 ships departed Lisbon. The journey was perilous. They sailed past the Canary Islands, down the coast of Africa to the Cape Verde Islands, and then farther south. In November, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope, Dias's stormy cape. From there, da Gama pressed on, entering waters no European had ever charted. They sailed up the eastern coast of Africa, stopping at ports in Mozambique, Mombasa, and Malindi. Here, da Gama encountered Arab and Swahili traders who controlled the Indian Ocean trade. These encounters were tense, often hostile. The Portuguese were outsiders, unknown and unwelcome. Yet at Malindi, da Gama found an ally who gave him a skilled navigator, familiar with the monsoon winds that carried ships across the Arabian Sea. In May 1498, after nearly a year at sea, da Gama's ships reached Calicut, Kozhikode, on the southwest coast of India. It was an arrival that would change the world. The markets overflowed with spices, jewels, silks, treasures beyond imagination. The Portuguese had done what no European had accomplished. They had reached India by sea, bypassing the overland routes controlled by Muslim and Venetian merchants. The return voyage was grueling. Disease and scurvy ravaged the crews. Of the original 170 men, less than half survived. Yet when da Gama returned to Lisbon in 1499, he was hailed as a hero. The wealth of the East was now within Portugal's grasp. The sea route to India was no longer a dream, it was reality. The impact of discovery. The voyages of Dias and da Gama transformed Portugal overnight. A small kingdom on the edge of Europe suddenly found itself at the center of global trade. Spices, once rare and precious, began to flow into Lisbon. Pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg goods that fetched fortunes in European markets now filled Portuguese ships. Lisbon became a hub of commerce, wealth pouring in from seas that only recently had been feared as the edge of the world. But the impact was more than economic. Psychologically, the voyages expanded the very boundaries of the possible. The world was larger than anyone had imagined, and Portugal had proven that it could be navigated, mapped, and mastered. The ocean was no longer an endless void, it was a highway, and the Portuguese, daring and relentless, were its first true masters. Conflict and power. These discoveries also set Portugal on a collision course with other powers. The Ottomans, whose empire controlled the eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, saw their trade threatened. Venice, long dependent on eastern goods, watched in horror as Lisbon challenged its monopoly. Spain, meanwhile, had backed another voyager, Christopher Columbus, whose 1492 voyage west had opened the Americas. To prevent conflict, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, dividing the non-European world between them along an imaginary line. The East, including Africa and Asia, fell to Portugal, the West, including the Americas, to Spain. It was a bold agreement, drawn on maps that were still incomplete, but it gave Portugal a mandate to pursue its eastern ambitions. The legacy of Dias and da Gama, Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama, were not merely sailors. They were harbingers of a new age. Dias had shown that the world's barriers could be broken. Da Gama had shown that they could be crossed. Their voyages were triumphs of courage, endurance, and vision, yet they were also the beginning of something more complicated: empire. The Portuguese presence in India would not be limited to trade. Soon, forts, cannons, and fleets would follow as Portugal sought to dominate the Indian Ocean by force as well as commerce. Still, in the glow of their triumphs, Portugal stood at the height of promise. A kingdom that had once been a frontier of Europe was now a frontier of the world. Its caravels cut across seas no other dared sail. Its name was spoken in markets from Lisbon to Calicut. The horizon had been conquered, and beyond it lay riches, power, and destiny. The voyages of Dias and da Gama were not the end of exploration. They were its beginning. Others would follow, carrying Portugal's flag farther still, to Africa, to India, to the Spice Islands, to China, to Brazil. The world was opening, and Portugal was at its helm. The ocean had ceased to be mystery. It had become empire. By the turn of the 16th century, the small Atlantic kingdom of Portugal stood at the threshold of greatness. In just a few decades, its sailors had transformed the map of the world. Bartolomeo Dias had rounded the stormy southern tip of Africa. Vasco da Gama had reached the shores of India. The seas that once terrified Europeans had become Portuguese highways. And now, Lisbon, the once modest capital on the Tagus, was poised to become the beating heart of a global empire. This was the age of empire, when Portugal's caravels carried not just explorers, but conquerors, merchants, missionaries, and kings' ambitions. No longer content with discovery alone, Portugal sought to control. From Brazil to India, from Africa to the Spice Islands, its ships would plant banners, build fortresses, and command seas. The reign of King Manuel I, the architect of this transformation, was King Manuel I, called the Fortunate. He inherited a kingdom already blessed by the achievements of Dias and da Gama, but under his reign, fortune seemed almost miraculous. When da Gama returned from India in 1499, Manuel grasped the opportunity with both hands. He envisioned not just trade but domination. Portugal would not merely sail to the east, it would rule it. Lisbon became the center of a new kind of empire. Gold, pepper, cinnamon, and jewels flowed into its markets. Exotic animals, elephants, leopards, parrots were paraded through its streets, astonishing Europe. Envoys from distant lands came to the Portuguese court, bearing gifts and seeking alliances. For a brief, dazzling moment, Portugal seemed destined to command the world. The African coast and Brazil. The empire stretched first along the African coast. Portuguese forts dotted the shoreline. São Jorge da Mina, Elmina in modern Ghana, built in 1482, became the hub of the gold trade. From these strongholds, Portugal tapped into Africa's riches, trading for gold, ivory, and increasingly enslaved people. The slave trade, begun in the 15th century, now expanded dramatically, its human cost casting a dark shadow over Portugal's glory. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new land awaited. In 1500, on his way to India, Pedro Alvarez Cabral was blown off course and landed on the coast of South America. He claimed the territory for Portugal, Brazil. At first, it seemed a sideshow compared to India's spices. But in time, Brazil would become Portugal's greatest colony, a land of immense wealth in sugar, gold, and eventually coffee. The Indian Ocean Empire. The true jewel of Portugal's expansion, however, was the Indian Ocean. In 1500, Cabral continued his voyage after Brazil and reached Calicut, where his fleet clashed with local merchants. The Portuguese quickly realized that trade alone would not secure their position, they needed force. Enter Afonso de Albuquerque, the great military commander and governor who forged Portugal's Eastern Empire. With a ruthless blend of diplomacy and cannon fire, Albuquerque established Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean. In 1510, he captured Goa on the west coast of India, making it the capital of Portugal's Asian Empire. In 1511, he seized Malacca in modern Malaysia, controlling the gateway to the Spice Islands. And in 1515, he established a base at Hormuz, commanding the entrance to the Persian Gulf. Through these conquests, Portugal controlled the choke points of global trade. Any ships sailing to or from the riches of Asia had to reckon with Portuguese forts and fleets. Lisbon became the funnel through which the spices of the East reached Europe. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and cinnamon poured into the warehouses of the Tagus, fetching prices so high that Portugal's wealth seemed limitless. China and Japan. But the Portuguese did not stop there. They pushed farther still, beyond the known limits of the world. In 1513, Jorge Alvarez reached the coast of China, opening trade with the Ming dynasty. By 1557, the Portuguese secured a foothold at Macau, which became the gateway for European trade with China for centuries. In 1543, Portuguese traders arrived in Japan bringing firearms and new technologies that would change the course of Japanese history. They established trade in Nagasaki, introducing not only goods but also Christianity. Jesuit missionaries, most famously Francis Xavier, followed in their wake, spreading the faith to distant lands. The spiritual mission. For Portugal, empire was not only about wealth, it was also about faith. The Reconquista spirit still burned, and the Portuguese crown saw itself as the sword of Christendom. Missionaries traveled with soldiers and merchants, carrying crosses into Africa, India, and Asia. Churches rose beside forts. Conversions accompanied trade. The spread of Christianity became both justification and companion to empire. Yet faith also created conflict. In India, Muslim and Hindu rulers resisted both Portuguese canons and missionaries. In Japan and China, suspicion of Christianity eventually led to persecution and the closing of ports. Still, for a time, Portuguese missionaries dreamed of nothing less than a world united under Christ, with Lisbon as its center. Glory and fragility. For all its brilliance, the Portuguese Empire was fragile. It was built not on vast armies, but on ships, forts, and daring. Portugal's population was small, its resources limited. To control a trade network that stretched from Brazil to Japan was a feat of extraordinary audacity, but also of overreach. Rival powers watched hungrily. Spain eyed Brazil. The Dutch and English, rising in the 16th century, envied Portugal's spice monopoly. The Ottoman Empire, dominant in the Middle East, contested Portuguese expansion fiercely. Yet for nearly a century, Portugal held on. Its caravels, laden with spices and gold, continued to sail homeward, enriching Lisbon and dazzling Europe. The kingdom seemed blessed, its place in history secured. The empire's legacy. By the middle of the 16th century, Portugal was at the height of its power. Its empire spanned 4 continents. Its influence touched every ocean. It was the first truly global empire, a precursor to the world of interconnected trade we know today. The legacy of this empire is complex. It brought wealth, innovation, and knowledge, introducing Europe to new foods, ideas, and technologies. But it also brought conquest, exploitation, and the slave trade, spreading suffering alongside faith and commerce. The glory of Portugal's empire was built on both brilliance and brutality. Still, in the great arc of history, Portugal's achievements were extraordinary. A small kingdom on the edge of Europe had leapt across oceans and carved out a place among the powers of the world. The sea had been its destiny, and empire its crown. As the 16th century advanced, Portugal basked in its golden age, but already shadows gathered on the horizon. The very forces that had lifted Portugal to greatness, its small size, its daring, its reliance on the sea, would also expose it to vulnerability. Rivals would challenge its supremacy. Dynastic crises would shake its throne, and the empire that once seemed eternal would face decline. But for now, in this moment of glory, Portugal was the empire of the seas, its caravels sailing farther and faster than any before, its flag planted on coasts from Brazil to Macau. The story of Portugal had become the story of the world. By the middle of the 16th century, Portugal stood astride the world like no kingdom before it. From Lisbon, the caravels fanned outward, carrying gold from Africa, spices from India, silks from China, and sugar from Brazil. Its empire stretched across oceans, its name whispered in markets from Antwerp to Nagasaki. To Europe, Portugal appeared dazzling, an improbable jewel of wealth and wonder, carved from the daring of sailors and the ambition of kings. But glory and greed are twin flames. What illuminated Portugal also burned it from within. The 16th century, Portugal's golden age, was also an age of overreach, corruption, and fragility. The empire dazzled, but it stood on precarious foundations. Lisbon, the queen of the Atlantic, Lisbon in the 16th century, was transformed. Once a modest medieval city, it now became the hub of a global empire. Ships crowded its harbor, their sails billowing with winds from every ocean. Warehouses overflowed with pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove spices worth more than their weight in gold. Merchants grew rich overnight, fortunes made in a single voyage. The streets buzzed with languages: Portuguese, Castilian, Italian, Arabic, Gujarati, Swahili. The court of King Manuel I and, later, King João III glittered with wealth. Ambassadors from Persia, India, and Ethiopia knelt before the Portuguese throne. Exotic animals paraded through Lisbon streets: lions, elephants, and leopards, symbols of faraway conquests. Churches rose, their walls lined with azulejos and gilded with the riches of the East. Manuel's construction of the Jeronimos Monastery and the Tower of Belém, masterpieces of the Manueline style, embodied Portugal's glory stone transformed into lace, carved with ropes, corals, and symbols of the sea. Yet even amid splendor, Lisbon was also a city of shadows. The influx of wealth bred inequality. Nobles and merchants flaunted their riches, while laborers crowded in alleys, many of them enslaved Africans brought to Portugal in ever-growing numbers. The same ships that carried spices also carried human cargo. Lisbon became one of Europe's largest slave markets, a stark reminder that the empire's brilliance was entwined with brutality. India and the Eastern Empire. In the Indian Ocean, Portuguese power was at its zenith. Fortresses at Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz gave Portugal control of vital trade routes. Cannon-armed caravels enforced dominance, blasting rivals from the seas. Goa became the glittering jewel of the Eastern Empire, a city of churches, palaces, and markets that rivaled Lisbon itself. But Portuguese rule in the east was not uncontested. Muslim traders, Ottoman fleets, and local rulers resisted fiercely. Battles raged at Diu, Chal, and Malacca. The Portuguese, few in number, relied on superior ships, guns, and ruthless tactics. They seized ports, destroyed competitors, and imposed a system of cartaz permits that every ship in the Indian Ocean had to buy to trade legally. In this way, Portugal tried to monopolize the sea. Still, empire demanded more than force. Jesuit missionaries, led by men like Francis Xavier, spread Christianity across India and Japan. Converts were won, churches built, and schools established. Faith, commerce, and conquest marched hand in hand, each reinforcing the other, yet conversion often clashed with local traditions, sowing seeds of resistance that would later erupt. Brazil, the sleeping giant. While the Eastern Empire glittered with spices, across the Atlantic another empire was awakening. Brazil, discovered in 1500 by Cabral, at first seemed secondary, but by the mid-16th century, its vast lands revealed their wealth. Sugarcane plantations multiplied, worked by enslaved Africans brought in increasing numbers. Brazilian sugar soon rivaled Indian spices as a source of profit. The forests of Brazil also offered dyewood, prized in Europe, and whispers of gold and silver tempted settlers deeper inland. Unlike the trading posts of Africa and Asia, Brazil was a land of settlement, where Portuguese colonists built towns, farms, and families. It would, in time, become the cornerstone of Portugal's empire in the West. Greed and corruption. Yet with wealth came corruption. Portuguese officials sent to govern distant lands often sought personal gain above royal duty. Bribery, smuggling, and exploitation were rampant. In Asia, many Portuguese abandoned Lisbon's strict monopoly, trading privately for their own fortunes. Some married local women, blending cultures and creating hybrid communities, Luso-Indian, Luso-African, Luso-Asian. These unions enriched culture but eroded centralized control. Greed also strained Portugal's resources. Its population was small, barely 1 million people in the early 16th century. To man fleets, garrison forts, and colonize lands across the world stretched Portugal thin. Every voyage demanded men and ships that the kingdom could scarcely supply. Even as Lisbon glittered, villages in Portugal often lay poor, their youth gone to sea. Shadows of rivalry. The Portuguese monopoly on global trade did not go unchallenged. The Ottoman Empire, dominant in the Middle East, fought fiercely to defend Muslim trade networks. Naval battles in the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf tested Portuguese resolve. Meanwhile, Spain, newly united under Ferdinand and Isabella, eyed Portugal's wealth with envy. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas had divided the non-European world between Spain and Portugal, but the line drawn on maps was vague, and disputes soon arose. When Spain's Christopher Columbus reached the Americas, the rivalry sharpened. Although Portugal secured Brazil, Spain claimed the rest of the New World, setting the stage for centuries of competition. By the late 16th century, new threats emerged. The Dutch and English, rising maritime powers, challenged Portuguese control in Asia. Armed with their own advanced ships and driven by their own greed, they would soon pry open Portugal's monopoly. The cost of glory. For now, however, Portugal's empire still shone. Yet beneath the gold and spices lay deep costs. The exploitation of enslaved Africans became central to Brazil's sugar economy, entrenching a system of cruelty that scarred millions. In Asia, Portuguese aggression often brought more resentment than loyalty. The church's zeal for conversion sometimes alienated as much as it inspired. At home, the wealth of empire distorted society. Nobles and merchants grew dependent on overseas riches, neglecting agriculture and local industry. Portugal's economy became tied to the success of its fleets. If the ships stopped coming, Lisbon would falter. The very success of empire made the kingdom vulnerable. The apex of ambition. Still, in the 16th century, Portugal basked in a golden glow. Its empire stretched farther than Rome's, touching lands Rome had never imagined. Its flag flew over castles in Africa, forts in India, markets in Malacca, and settlements in Brazil. Its sailors were legends, its kings courted by emperors, its missionaries preaching on the edges of the world. This was Portugal at its apex glory, and greed entwined. It had achieved what no kingdom its size had ever done. It had made the world its stage. But history is a wheel, and golden ages are fragile. Behind the triumphs lurked exhaustion, overreach, and dependence. The very empire that had made Portugal great would, in time, strain it to breaking. For now, though, the caravels still returned laden with riches, and Lisbon still sparkled as the queen of the Atlantic. Portugal had conquered horizons, and the 16th century was its crown. By the late 16th century, Portugal's empire glittered across the seas. From Brazil's sugar plantations to Goa's bustling markets, from Macau on the Chinese coast to the Spice Islands of the East Indies, the Portuguese crown commanded a realm that seemed limitless. Yet beneath the golden surface, cracks were widening. Wealth had bred dependency, corruption weakened administration, and Portugal's small population strained to defend an empire that spanned the globe. Into this fragile moment came a dynastic crisis, one that would plunge Portugal into 60 years of foreign rule under its larger neighbor, Spain. The crisis of succession. It began in 1578 with tragedy. King Sebastian I, a young monarch full of crusading zeal, led an ill-fated expedition to Morocco. At the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, his army was annihilated, and Sebastian himself vanished killed. Though his body was never conclusively identified, his death without heirs created a vacuum that shook Portugal to its core. Sebastian's successor was his great-uncle, the elderly Cardinal Henry, who reigned only briefly before dying in 1580, also without heirs. With his death, the Avis dynasty, which had ruled Portugal since the 14th century, came to an end. The question of succession ignited fierce competition. Several claimants emerged, but the strongest was Philip II of Spain, son of Isabella of Portugal, and thus grandson of King Manuel I. Backed by Spanish might, Philip pressed his claim with force. The fall of independence. In 1580, Spanish troops invaded Portugal under the command of the Duke of Alba. Resistance flared under Antonio, Prior of Crato, a rival claimant who rallied Portuguese patriots. For a brief moment, Antonio was even proclaimed king in Lisbon, but Spanish power proved overwhelming. At the Battle of Alcántara, Antonio's forces were crushed, and Portugal fell under Spanish rule. Thus began the Iberian Union, a dynastic union that placed Portugal and Spain under a single crown. Philip II became Philip I of Portugal, promising to respect Portuguese autonomy, laws, and empire. In theory, Portugal remained separate. In practice, it was absorbed into the vast Spanish monarchy. Life under the Habsburgs. For many Portuguese, the Iberian Union was a bitter pill. They had prided themselves on independence, on being distinct from their powerful Castilian neighbors. Now their king resided in Madrid, and their empire was entangled in Spain's wars. At first, Philip II kept his promises. Portuguese officials retained authority, Lisbon remained the empire's hub, and the colonies continued to send wealth home. But Spain's ambitions soon dragged Portugal into conflicts far from its shores. The Habsburg monarchy was at war with England, France, and the Dutch Republic. Portugal, through no choice of its own, became a target. In 1588, the Spanish Armada, partly funded and crewed by Portuguese resources, sailed against England and met disaster. The loss strained both crowns. Worse still, Portugal's colonies became prey to Spain's enemies. English privateers like Sir Francis Drake plundered Portuguese ships. The Dutch, rising as a maritime power, attacked Portuguese holdings in Africa, Brazil, and Asia. The once unchallenged Portuguese Empire began to unravel. Decline of an empire. The Dutch proved especially dangerous. Driven by their own hunger for spice wealth, they established the Dutch East India Company, VOC, in 1602, determined to seize Portugal's monopoly. One by one, Portuguese strongholds fell. The Dutch captured Malacca, attacked Goa, and eventually took the prized Spice Islands. In Brazil, they seized parts of Pernambuco, challenging Portuguese sugar production. At home, discontent simmered. Portuguese merchants resented Madrid's interference. Nobles and commoners alike bristled at the loss of autonomy. The promise that Portugal would remain distinct under Spanish rule felt increasingly hollow. Taxes rose, resources drained, and resentment deepened. Meanwhile, myths of King Sebastian's return took root. Known as Sebastianism, this belief held that Sebastian had not died at Alcácer Quibir, but would return one day to restore Portugal's glory. The myth became a symbol of resistance, a quiet defiance against Spanish rule, the spark of rebellion. By the 1640s, Spain itself was weakened. The Habsburgs faced revolts in Catalonia, wars with France, and endless strain on their treasury. In Portugal, conspiracies brewed. On December 1, 1640, a group of Portuguese nobles and patriots struck in Lisbon. They stormed the royal palace, killing the Spanish-appointed secretary, and proclaimed João, Duke of Braganza, as King João IV of Portugal. The restoration of independence had begun. The War of Restoration Spain did not yield easily. For 28 years, the two kingdoms fought. Portugal, though smaller, was buoyed by its unity and by alliances with England and France, eager to weaken Spain. Battles raged along the border, castles exchanged hands, and Lisbon braced for invasion. Yet Spain, overstretched by conflicts elsewhere, could not crush the Portuguese rebellion. Finally, in 1668, peace was signed. Spain recognized Portugal's independence, ending the Iberian Union. João IV and the Braganza dynasty were secure on the throne. Portugal was free once more. The cost and legacy. The 60 years of Spanish rule left deep scars. Portugal's empire had suffered grievous losses. Dutch and English rivals had seized territories and trade routes. The myth of invincibility, born in the days of Vasco da Gama, was shattered. Yet Portugal's survival as an independent kingdom was itself remarkable. Against the greatest power of Europe, it had endured. The Iberian Union also reinforced something essential: Portuguese identity. The years under Spanish rule deepened the sense of what it meant to be Portuguese, not Castilian, not merely Iberian, but distinct. The restoration was not only political, but cultural, a reaffirmation of nationhood. Portugal entered the late 17th century smaller in empire, poorer in wealth, but fiercely conscious of itself. The storm of union had passed. Independence, hard won, was secure. Yet the world was changing. The Dutch and English now dominated the seas. Spain was in decline, and France rose as a continental giant. Portugal, battered but alive, would have to find new ways to survive in a world no longer ruled by Iberian powers. The Empire of the Seas still existed, but its golden age had faded. Ahead lay new challenges: reform, resilience, and reinvention. When the bells of Lisbon rang out on December 1st, 1640, their sound carried more than the call of rebellion. They carried the rebirth of a nation. After 60 years of Spanish rule, Portugal rose again, determined to reclaim its place in the world. The coup that overthrew the Habsburg-appointed officials was sudden, daring, and fraught with risk. Yet it succeeded, and the Duke of Braganza, reluctant at first, was thrust onto the throne as King João IV, founder of the Braganza dynasty. Portugal had regained its crown, but independence would not come easily. Spain, though weakened, was still powerful. War loomed, and for 28 years, Portugal fought to secure what had been won in a single day of rebellion. João IV, the Restorer. João IV was not a conqueror by temperament. A country nobleman more inclined to music and hunting than to politics, he had not sought a throne. But when the conspirators of 1640 placed the crown upon his head, he accepted the burden. History would remember him as the Restorer, the monarch who embodied Portugal's resilience. From the start, João faced daunting challenges. The kingdom was drained from decades of neglect under Spanish rule. Its treasury was empty, its defenses weak, its empire besieged by the Dutch and English. Worst of all, Spain was determined to reclaim what it saw as a rebellious province. The War of Independence had only begun. The War of Restoration, the conflict known as the War of Restoration, stretched from 1640 to 1668. It was not a single decisive struggle, but a long war of attrition, waged across the borderlands of Portugal and Castile. Battles were fought at Montijo, 1644, Elvas, 1659, and Amexial, 1663, each testing Portugal's endurance. At first, survival seemed uncertain. Spain launched invasions, hoping to crush Portugal swiftly. Yet the Portuguese, though outnumbered, fought with desperation. Their fortresses along the frontier held firm, their soldiers inspired by the cause of independence. Foreign aid proved crucial. England, eager to weaken Spain, offered support, and France, embroiled in its own rivalry with the Habsburgs, lent assistance. By the 1660s, the tide had turned. Spanish power, stretched thin by wars in Catalonia, Italy, and the Netherlands, waned. Portuguese victories at Amexial and Montes Claros secured the kingdom's survival. Finally, in 1668, Spain formally recognized Portugal's independence in the Treaty of Lisbon. The Braganza dynasty was secure. Rebuilding a nation, João IV's reign was not only about war, it was also about reconstruction. He reorganized the army, fortified the borders, and rebuilt Lisbon's defenses. He restored institutions of governance neglected under the Habsburgs and reasserted Portugal's sovereignty over its church, ending Spanish interference. But the challenges were immense. The Portuguese Empire had suffered grievous losses during the Iberian Union. The Dutch had seized Malacca, parts of Ceylon, and Brazil's northeastern coast. English privateers harassed Portuguese shipping. The once unchallenged monopoly over the spice trade was broken. João IV understood that Portugal could not reclaim all that was lost. Instead, he focused on what could be preserved. The struggle for Brazil. Among the empire's possessions, Brazil became the most critical. Sugar plantations in Pernambuco and Bahia were the lifeblood of Portugal's wealth. During the Iberian Union, the Dutch had invaded, capturing Recife and large parts of the northeast. For years, the Dutch West India Company ruled over Brazil, extracting sugar profits and threatening Portugal's hold. But resistance grew. Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous allies joined in a long, bitter fight to reclaim their land. Known as the Luso-Brazilian Resistance, it culminated in the Battle of Guararapes, 1648 to 1649, often seen as the birth of Brazilian national identity. By 1654, the Dutch were expelled, and Portugal's claim to Brazil was restored. In the Treaty of The Hague, 1661, Portugal agreed to pay the Dutch compensation but retained Brazil. It was a compromise, but one that ensured the crown's most valuable colony remained intact. In time, Brazil would become the jewel of the Braganza Empire. The shifting balance of empire. Elsewhere, Portugal fared less well. In Asia, its forts and trading posts crumbled under Dutch and English pressure. The once mighty Estado da India, with its base in Goa, shrank to a fraction of its former glory. Malacca was lost, Ceylon largely surrendered, and the Spice Islands gone. In Africa too, Portugal faced encroachment. Yet the empire did not disappear. Goa remained, as did Macau, Mozambique, Angola, and above all, Brazil. Though reduced, Portugal's overseas possessions still stretched across 3 continents, giving the kingdom global reach. What had changed was balance. Portugal was no longer the master of the seas, but a player among rivals. A Queen's Alliance. One of João IV's most important achievements was the marriage alliance with England. His daughter, Catherine of Braganza, married Charles II of England in 1662. The dowry was immense, 2 million cruzados and the strategic ports of Bombay and Tangier. But the alliance was invaluable. It secured English military support in the Restoration War and bound Portugal to a rising maritime power. This marriage would have long echoes. Through Catherine, the Portuguese court introduced tea to England, beginning a cultural habit that endures to this day. And the transfer of Bombay planted the seed of Britain's future empire in India, a fateful reminder of how Portugal's fortunes were entwined with greater powers. Culture and identity. Amid war and hardship, João IV also nurtured Portugal's culture. A patron of music, he composed works himself, including religious choral pieces that survive today. He restored the University of Coimbra and encouraged scholarship. The Jesuits, dominant in education, continued to shape minds, while missionaries carried Portuguese culture to Brazil, Africa, and Asia. Most importantly, the Restoration deepened Portuguese identity. After 60 years under Spain, independence was more than political. It was emotional, cultural, spiritual. The people embraced their language, their traditions, their sense of uniqueness. Sebastianism, the myth of the lost king's return, faded into history, replaced by pride in the Braganzas who had restored the crown. The legacy of João IV. João IV died in 1656, worn down by years of struggle. His reign had been one of constant war, sacrifice, and survival, yet he left behind a kingdom free, a dynasty secure, and an empire preserved, if diminished. His epithet, the Restorer, was well earned. The Braganza dynasty would continue to rule Portugal for nearly 3 centuries, guiding it through triumphs and tragedies, revolutions, and reforms. The Restoration of Independence was their founding act, and it gave Portugal not just a dynasty, but a renewed sense of self. Portugal, after the Restoration, by 1668, Portugal was independent, but its place in the world had changed. No longer the dominant maritime power, it now lived in the shadow of larger empires: Spain, France, England, and the Dutch Republic. Its future would depend on alliances, resilience, and adaptation. But the Restoration proved something vital. Portugal, small though it was, would not be erased. Against overwhelming odds, it had fought for 60 years and won back its sovereignty. The spirit of Afonso Henriques, the founder king, seemed alive again in João IV, the restorer king. The 17th century had tested Portugal's survival, and it had endured. Ahead lay new challenges: economic reforms, natural disasters, and the shifting tides of European politics. Yet in the Restoration, Portugal had proven its identity unbreakable. The Braganza dynasty, born in rebellion, would now guide the nation into a new era. The 17th century had been a fight for survival. Portugal had clawed back its independence, restored its monarchy under the Braganzas, and defended its empire against Dutch and Spanish rivals. By the dawn of the 18th century, the kingdom stood free, but weary. Its empire was no longer the unrivaled giant of the 16th century, yet it still possessed treasures across the seas. Now, fortune would turn its gaze westward to Brazil, and tragedy would strike at home in Lisbon, reshaping the very fabric of Portuguese society. Brazil, the Golden Colony. In the early 18th century, Brazil became Portugal's lifeline. Vast sugar plantations continued to enrich the crown, but it was the discovery of gold and later diamonds in Minas Gerais that transformed the colony into a glittering prize. Streams of fortune hunters, Portuguese settlers, African slaves, and indigenous labor flooded into the interior. Entire towns like Ouro Preto sprang up almost overnight, their churches adorned with Baroque splendor, funded by gold dust. The wealth was staggering. By mid-century, Brazil produced nearly half the world's gold. Ships laden with treasure crossed the Atlantic, filling Lisbon's coffers and making Portugal appear wealthy once more. The crown imposed strict control, taxing heavily and ensuring that 1/5 of all gold, the famous quinto, went directly to the royal treasury. Diamonds, discovered in the 1720s, added even more brilliance to the stream. Yet beneath the glitter lay exploitation. Enslaved Africans, brought in ever greater numbers, endured brutal conditions in mines and plantations. Indigenous peoples, displaced from their lands, suffered violence and enslavement. The wealth that adorned Lisbon's palaces and gilded its churches was bought with human misery. Still, for a time, Brazil's riches masked Portugal's deeper weaknesses. The kingdom grew dependent on colonial gold, neglecting agriculture and industry at home. Lisbon sparkled, but rural Portugal remained poor, its fields underworked, its peasants struggling. This imbalance would one day prove disastrous. Lisbon, the splendor before the storm. By mid-18th century, Lisbon had become one of Europe's grandest capitals. Wealth from Brazil poured into its docks, and the city became a marketplace for the world. Elegant palaces lined its streets, churches gleamed with gilded woodwork, and libraries and academies flourished. Travelers marveled at its beauty, calling it a jewel of the Atlantic. Yet beneath this grandeur, Lisbon was vulnerable. Its buildings, crammed along narrow streets, were not designed for resilience. Its people, complacent in wealth, could not foresee the calamity that was to come. The Great Earthquake of 1755. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day, Lisbon was crowded with worshippers, filling its many churches. The air was filled with incense, the sound of bells, the murmur of prayers. At 9:40 a.m., the earth began to shake. The tremors were violent, tearing through the city with unimaginable force. Buildings crumbled, churches collapsed upon congregations, and palaces split apart. In minutes, much of Lisbon was reduced to rubble. Survivors fled toward the river, seeking safety only to see the sea withdraw ominously. Moments later, a massive tsunami swept into the harbor, drowning hundreds. Fires, sparked by candles in fallen churches, raged through the ruins, burning for days. By the time the catastrophe subsided, Lisbon lay in ruins. Tens of thousands were dead. Some say a third of the city's population. Palaces, churches, libraries, and archives were gone. The shock reverberated not only through Portugal, but across Europe. Voltaire, in his Candide, would ask bitterly, "Was this the best of all possible worlds?" The earthquake shook not just buildings, but philosophies, challenging faith in a benevolent order. The Marquis of Pombal. Into this devastation stepped one man who would define Portugal's 18th century, Sebastião José de Carvalho y Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. A statesman of fierce will and ruthless determination, Pombal seized the crisis as an opportunity to reshape Portugal. Appointed by King José I, Pombal took command of relief efforts with legendary decisiveness. Bury the dead and feed the living, he ordered, cutting through paralysis. He organized food distribution, restored order, and, most remarkably, oversaw the rebuilding of Lisbon. The reconstruction was revolutionary. Pombal's architects designed the Baixa Pombalina, Lisbon's downtown, with wide streets, rational grids, and earthquake-resistant buildings. The new Lisbon was one of Europe's first modern planned cities, a symbol of resilience rising from ashes. But Pombal's ambitions went far beyond rebuilding. He sought to transform Portugal itself. Reform and absolutism. Pombal was a reformer, but also an autocrat. He believed Portugal had grown decadent, dependent on Brazil's gold, and weakened by aristocratic privilege and clerical power. His mission was to modernize the kingdom by force if necessary. He curbed the power of the nobility, exiling or humiliating those who opposed him. He targeted the Jesuits, whom he saw as rivals in education and influence, expelling them from Portugal and its empire in 1759. Their schools and missions were seized, their order branded enemies of the crown. Economically, Pombal sought to diversify Portugal's base. He promoted new industries, textiles, glass, and vineyards, establishing companies and regulating trade. He tried to reduce dependence on England, with whom Portugal had long been bound by trade treaties. He also reformed taxation and sought to ensure a more equitable system of governance. In Brazil, Pombal tightened control over gold production, clamping down on smuggling and rebellions. His rule was stern, often brutal, but effective in restoring royal authority. Enlightenment and contradictions. Pombal was a man of the Enlightenment, inspired by reason, progress, and efficiency. Under his guidance, education was reformed, scientific studies encouraged, and secular authority strengthened. Yet his methods were autocratic, his opponents silenced, his power near absolute. He embodied both the light and shadow of Enlightenment absolutism. For many Portuguese, Pombal was a savior, the man who rebuilt Lisbon, modernized the economy, and curbed aristocratic excess. For others, he was a tyrant, ruthless in crushing dissent and merciless in his reforms. The end of Pombal's era. King José I, Pombal's staunch supporter, died in 1777. His daughter, Maria I, ascended the throne and dismissed Pombal almost immediately. The aging minister was forced into retirement, his enemies reveling in his fall. Yet his legacy could not be erased. Lisbon remained his monument, and the reforms he enacted continued to shape Portugal. Portugal in the 18th century. By century's end, Portugal was transformed. Lisbon had risen from ruins, rational and resilient. The crown was stronger, the nobility weakened, the church curtailed. Brazil remained the empire's jewel, its gold sustaining Portugal even as European rivals grew stronger. Yet dependence on Brazil's wealth remained a weakness. When the goldfields began to decline later in the century, Portugal once again faced economic fragility. The reforms of Pombal had modernized but not fully industrialized the kingdom. Portugal remained vulnerable, a small power in a world dominated by giants like Britain and France. Winds of change. The Lisbon earthquake of 1755 was more than a disaster. It was a turning point. It revealed Portugal's fragility, destroyed its old order, and opened the way for reform. The Marquis of Pombal, with his iron will, harnessed tragedy into transformation. He gave Portugal a new Lisbon, a stronger crown, and a taste of Enlightenment modernity. But he also revealed the limits of reform in a society bound by tradition, empire, and dependence on colonial wealth. His age was one of brilliance and contradiction, of resilience and repression. As the 18th century closed, the winds of change blew ever stronger across Europe. Revolution stirred in America, then in France. The world order was shifting, and Portugal, still tied to its empire, would soon be swept into storms it could not escape. At the dawn of the 19th century, Portugal stood once again at a dangerous crossroads. The grandeur of the 16th century was a fading memory. The reforms of the Marquis of Pombal still echoing but no longer guiding the present. Brazil remained the jewel of the empire, its sugar and gold sustaining the crown, yet Portugal itself was a small kingdom caught between giants. Across Europe, a storm was gathering, a storm named Napoleon Bonaparte, Portugal and the British alliance. For centuries, Portugal had relied on its oldest ally, England. The Anglo-Portuguese alliance, sealed in treaties dating back to the Middle Ages, had ensured survival against Castile, Spain, and even during the Restoration Wars. By the late 18th century, that alliance had become both lifeline and chain. Portugal's economy depended heavily on British trade. English merchants dominated Lisbon's markets, British fleets protected Portuguese shipping, and British loans propped up the treasury. When Napoleon rose to power in France and sought to strangle Britain through his continental system, an economic blockade designed to cut Britain off from European trade, Portugal became an immediate target. To Napoleon, Portugal's loyalty to Britain was intolerable. The French invasions. In 1807, Napoleon ordered the invasion of Portugal. French troops under General Junot marched across the border, meeting little resistance. Lisbon fell without a major battle. Yet what happened next was unprecedented in European history. Rather than face capture, the Portuguese royal family, led by Prince Regent João, later King João VI, fled across the Atlantic to Brazil. Escorted by the British Navy, the entire court, nobles, officials, and even archives boarded ships and sailed for Rio de Janeiro. For the first time, a European monarchy transplanted itself wholesale to its colony. Portugal was left occupied, its king ruling from the other side of the ocean. The royal court in Brazil. When João and his court arrived in Rio de Janeiro in 1808, the city was transformed overnight. Once a colonial capital, Rio became the center of a European monarchy. Palaces were built, theaters opened, libraries established. The Royal Library of Portugal, containing thousands of volumes, was shipped across the Atlantic. The colony became, in effect, the metropole. For Brazil, this was revolutionary. No longer merely a colony, it now hosted the crown itself. Ports were open to trade with Britain and other nations, breaking the old colonial monopoly. Institutions of governance, education, and culture flourished. For the first time, Brazil felt like the beating heart of the Portuguese world. For Portugal, however, the exile was humiliating. Lisbon languished under French occupation, its people resentful of foreign soldiers and abandoned by their monarch. Resistance, however, began to grow. Guerrilla war and British aid. The French occupation sparked fierce resistance. Peasants, clergy, and nobles alike rose in arms, waging guerrilla war against Napoleon's troops. Villages ambushed convoys, priests preached rebellion, and bands of irregulars harassed the invaders at every turn. The Portuguese people, though leaderless, proved unyielding. Britain too would not allow Portugal to fall. Under the command of Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, British and Portuguese forces launched campaigns to liberate the kingdom. In 1808, the Anglo-Portuguese army defeated the French at Vimiero, forcing Junot to withdraw. But Napoleon was not finished. Two more invasions followed. In 1809, Marshal Soult invaded from Galicia, capturing Porto before being expelled. In 1810 to 1811, Marshal Massena led the largest invasion yet, driving deep into Portugal. But Wellington, aided by Portuguese troops, implemented a scorched earth strategy, devastating the land and starving the French advance. At the lines of Torres Vedras, massive fortifications built north of Lisbon, the French were stopped cold. Weakened and harassed, they retreated. By 1811, the French were expelled from Portugal. For the first time, the seemingly invincible armies of Napoleon had been defeated. Portugal, though battered, had survived once again. Transformation of Brazil. While the war raged in Europe, Brazil flourished under the presence of the royal court. João VI elevated Brazil's status, declaring it a kingdom equal to Portugal in 1815. The United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves was born. For Brazilians, this was liberation from centuries of colonial subordination. For the Portuguese in Europe, it was unsettling to see the empire's center shift across the ocean. Rio de Janeiro became a cosmopolitan capital, filled with European institutions and ideas. Printing presses published newspapers, theaters staged operas, and the city hummed with commerce. Brazil's sense of identity grew stronger. The return of the king. With Napoleon's defeat in 1814, pressure mounted for the royal court to return to Lisbon. The Portuguese elites, resentful of their diminished role, demanded the king's presence. João VI delayed, reluctant to abandon Brazil. But in 1821, under pressure from liberal revolutions sweeping Portugal, he returned, leaving his son, Pedro, as regent in Brazil. This decision would have profound consequences. Within a year, Brazil declared independence under Pedro, who became Emperor Pedro I. Portugal's jewel was lost. Yet for now, João VI was back in Lisbon, trying to govern a kingdom transformed by war and revolution. Legacy of the Napoleonic era. The Napoleonic Wars reshaped Portugal in profound ways. Militarily, they proved the resilience of the Portuguese people and the value of the British alliance. Politically, they exposed the fragility of the monarchy, ruling from exile. Economically, they deepened dependence on Britain, whose merchants dominated Lisbon even more after the war. Most dramatically, the exile of the royal court to Brazil shifted the empire's balance permanently. What had been the colony became the capital. What had been the heart, Lisbon, became the periphery. The seeds of Brazil's independence were sown in those years when the colony tasted equality and self-rule. For Portugal, the Napoleonic storm was both survival and loss. The kingdom endured, free from Napoleon's grasp, but it returned to a Europe where its greatest colony was slipping away. A kingdom in transition. By the 1820s, Portugal was a nation in flux. Independence had been secured, but at great cost. The monarchy was weakened, the economy tethered to Britain, and Brazil, the empire's lifeblood, was on the path to separation. The Napoleonic Wars had tested Portugal's endurance, and it had survived, but the glory days of empire were fading. The age ahead would bring new storms, liberal revolutions, civil wars, and the struggle to redefine Portugal's place in a world where its colonial empire was slipping away. The Napoleonic storm had passed, but in its wake, Portugal found itself profoundly transformed. The kingdom had survived foreign invasion, preserved its monarchy, and even elevated Brazil to co-equal status within the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. Yet this transformation carried seeds of loss. When King João VI returned to Lisbon in 1821, leaving his son Pedro in Rio de Janeiro, he did not realize that he was leaving behind not just a regent, but the future emperor of an independent Brazil. The 19th century would become an era of struggle for Portugal, struggles of identity, governance, and survival. No longer the mighty empire of the seas, Portugal was forced to reckon with the loss of its greatest colony, the upheaval of liberal revolutions, and the turbulence of civil war. It was a century of diminished horizons, but also of resilience, as the kingdom sought to redefine itself in a changing world. Brazil breaks away. In 1820, a liberal revolution erupted in Porto. Inspired by the constitutional movements sweeping Europe, Portuguese liberals demanded reform, curbs on royal absolutism, and the return of the king from Brazil. Under pressure, João VI sailed back to Lisbon in 1821, reluctantly leaving his son Pedro as regent in Rio. The Cortes Parliament in Lisbon soon demanded that Brazil be reduced again to colonial status, its autonomy revoked. but Brazil had tasted equality. Its elites, enriched by trade and emboldened by the presence of the royal court, refused to submit. In September 1822, Pedro declared Brazil's independence, famously proclaiming the Cry of Ipiranga, Independencia ou Morte, independence or death. He became Emperor Pedro I of Brazil, severing centuries of colonial rule. For Portugal, the loss was devastating. Brazil was its richest possession, the cornerstone of its empire. Gold, sugar, coffee, all gone in a stroke. Though João VI accepted the new reality reluctantly, the kingdom never recovered the scale of wealth it had once enjoyed. The empire was reduced to scattered colonies in Africa and Asia, still valuable but far from Brazil's magnitude. A kingdom in crisis. The loss of Brazil coincided with deep political upheaval at home. The 19th century in Portugal was marked by a fierce struggle between absolutists, who favored strong royal power, and liberals, who sought constitutional monarchy and reform. This clash erupted into civil wars that scarred the kingdom for decades. After João VI's death in 1826, the succession crisis deepened. His son, Pedro I of Brazil, briefly became Pedro IV of Portugal, but he abdicated in favor of his young daughter, Maria II, before returning to Brazil. In doing so, he issued the Constitutional Charter of 1826, a compromise between absolutism and liberalism. But Pedro's brother Miguel rejected the charter. Styling himself as champion of tradition, Miguel seized power in 1828, proclaiming himself king. Thus began the Liberal Wars, 1828 to 1834, a brutal conflict between Miguel's absolutists and supporters of Maria II, who fought for constitutional government. The Liberal Wars. The Liberal Wars were not just dynastic, they were ideological. On Miguel's side stood conservative nobles, rural peasants, and clerics who feared liberal reform. On Maria's side stood liberals, urban elites, and many who embraced the winds of change sweeping Europe. For 6 bloody years, Portugal was torn apart. Battles raged across the land, cities were besieged, and families divided. Exiles fled abroad, raising armies to return. In 1832, Pedro abdicated in Brazil and returned to Europe, leading a liberal expedition that landed in the Azores, then sailed to Porto. There, his forces endured a long siege before finally triumphing. In 1834, Miguel was defeated and exiled, and Maria II was restored as queen under a constitutional monarchy. The liberals had won, but the kingdom was exhausted. The war devastated the economy, deepened divisions, and left Portugal fragile. Yet it also set the course of its 19th century politics. Portugal would be a constitutional monarchy, though plagued by instability, political turbulence. The decades that followed were marked by turbulence. Different factions of liberals, the Chartists, favoring Pedro's constitutional charter, and the Septembrists, favoring a more radical constitution, struggled for dominance. Coups, revolts, and counter-revolts became common. The monarchy survived, but its authority was constantly tested. Economic challenges compounded political strife. With Brazil gone, Portugal's economy depended heavily on Britain. Trade treaties favored British merchants, often at the expense of Portuguese industry. Agriculture remained backward, industry limited, and poverty widespread in the countryside. Lisbon and Porto were lively ports, but much of Portugal lagged behind Europe's industrial revolution. Africa and Asia, the shrunken empire. Even as Portugal weakened at home, it clung to its overseas possessions. Angola and Mozambique in Africa, Goa in India, Macau in China, and Timor in Southeast Asia remained under Portuguese control. But these colonies were often more symbolic than profitable, maintained at great cost, and frequently challenged by rising European rivals. In Africa, Portugal began to shift from coastal trading posts toward deeper territorial claims, laying groundwork for the colonial ambitions of the late 19th century. In Asia, its presence was increasingly overshadowed by Britain and the Netherlands. Macau remained, but it was a small outpost compared to the bustling British colony of Hong Kong. The empire that once spanned the globe was now a shadow of its former self. Yet Portugal held on, defining itself as an imperial power even in decline. Culture and society. Amid turmoil, the 19th century also brought cultural flowering. Portuguese writers, poets, and intellectuals grappled with the kingdom's struggles and identity. Almeida Garrett, a leader of the Romantic movement, infused literature with patriotism and nostalgia. Alexandra Herculano, historian and novelist, chronicled Portugal's medieval past with scholarly rigor. Their works reflected both pride in the nation's history and anxiety about its future. Urban life in Lisbon and Porto changed as well. Railways, gaslighting, and new boulevards brought modernity, though unevenly. The gulf between city and countryside widened. For many peasants, life remained harsh, bound by poverty, tradition, and emigration. Waves of Portuguese left for Brazil, the Americas, and Africa, seeking fortunes that their homeland could not provide. The waning century. By the late 19th century, Portugal was a kingdom diminished. Its monarchy, though constitutional, remained unstable, with frequent changes of government. Its economy lagged behind Europe's industrial powers. Its empire, though still spanning continents, was weak compared to the vast colonies of Britain and France. And yet, Portugal endured. Its people carried with them a deep sense of identity, rooted in centuries of struggle against Moors, against Spain, against decline itself. The memory of Afonso Henriques, João IV, and the Age of Discovery lived on. Even as Portugal faced modern challenges, the 19th century had been an age of loss. Brazil gone, civil wars fought, poverty entrenched. But it was also an age of resilience, where Portugal, small and fragile, refused to vanish. Its empire remained, its monarchy survived, and its culture thrived. Ahead lay the 20th century, when storms of republicanism, dictatorship, and revolution would once again reshape Portugal. But in the 19th, the story was one of endurance, of a nation humbled, yet still alive. When the dust of the Napoleonic Wars settled, Portugal was no longer the confident empire that had once ruled the seas. The 19th century pressed upon it with the force of political revolutions, ideological battles, and social transformation. Portugal had lost Brazil, the richest jewel of its crown, and now faced the daunting task of redefining itself, not as the commander of vast oceans, but as a fragile European monarchy struggling for survival. The period between the 1820s and 1850s became one of unrelenting turbulence, a theater where absolutists and liberals clashed in repeated conflicts that scarred the kingdom. Yet amid the chaos, Portugal's constitutional system began to take root, though fragile and contested. This chapter in Portugal's history is one of turmoil, but also of resilience, a nation battered by war and instability, yet clinging to the dream of order and progress. The aftermath of Brazilian independence. The shock of Brazil's independence in 1822 could hardly be overstated. Economically, Portugal lost not just resources but its central role in the transatlantic world. Politically, it revealed the vulnerability of a monarchy that could not contain its own empire. Emotionally, it was a wound that cut deep into the Portuguese psyche, and yet the loss of Brazil was not an end, but a beginning of new upheavals. With João VI's death in 1826, the question of succession opened fissures that would split the nation in two. Pedro IV and the constitutional charter, João's elder son, Pedro, already Emperor of Brazil, inherited the Portuguese crown as Pedro IV. But he could not rule both Brazil and Portugal. In an effort to reconcile, Pedro abdicated the throne in favor of his young daughter, Maria da Glória, Maria II, issuing at the same time the Constitutional Charter of 1826. The charter was a compromise, a constitutional monarchy that preserved royal authority but introduced a parliamentary system. It sought balance between tradition and modernity. To liberals, it was a step forward. To absolutists, it was betrayal. Miguel and the usurpation Pedro's younger brother Miguel returned from exile in 1828 under the pretense of serving as regent for Maria II. But soon, he seized power outright, proclaiming himself King Miguel I and abolishing the constitutional charter. Absolutism was restored with fire and sword. The result was civil war, the Liberal Wars, also known as the Miguelite Wars. The Liberal Wars, 1828-1834, Portugal was plunged into 6 years of bloodshed. On one side stood Miguel's absolutists, conservative nobles, rural peasants devoted to the church, and those fearful of liberal reform. On the other side stood liberals loyal to Maria II and the constitutional cause, merchants, intellectuals, and exiled aristocrats determined to modernize the kingdom. Battles scarred the land, families divided, brothers fighting brothers. In 1832, Pedro, having abdicated the Brazilian throne, sailed to the Azores and organized a liberal army. From there, he launched a daring expedition to the mainland, capturing Porto and enduring a year-long siege. The tide turned in 1834. With British support, liberal forces pressed south, and Miguel was defeated at the Battle of Asaqueira. Exiled once more, he lived out his days abroad, forbidden ever to return. Maria Saint was restored as queen, and constitutional monarchy was reaffirmed. Fragile liberalism victory did not mean peace. Portugal emerged from the liberal wars exhausted, divided, and unstable. The Charter of 1826 remained in force, but liberals themselves split into factions. The Chartists defended the 1826 Charter, favoring moderate constitutional monarchy. The Septembrists, inspired by the Revolution of September 1836, demanded a more radical constitution that granted broader rights and limited royal power. Further, coups and counter-coups followed. Governments rose and fell with dizzying frequency. The promise of constitutional monarchy became entangled in endless factionalism. The revolutions of the mid-century, the turbulence reached new heights with the Patalia, or Little Civil War of 1846 to 1847, when rival liberal factions once again turned to arms. Queen Maria II's reign was consumed by instability, though she herself remained a symbol of continuity. Foreign powers intervened repeatedly, particularly Britain, eager to preserve Portugal as a stable ally. This period left scars on society. Peasants bore the brunt of armies marching across the countryside. The economy languished under debt and dependence on foreign trade. Emigration surged as thousands of Portuguese left for Brazil or other lands, fleeing poverty and unrest. Slow steps towards stability. By the mid-19th century, however, exhaustion with conflict began to foster compromise. Gradually, Chartists and Septembrists sought reconciliation. The regeneration movement of the 1850s marked a turning point. Political leaders like the Duke of Saldanha and Fontes Pereira de Melo promoted modernization, building railways, reforming education, and encouraging industrialization. Though corruption and inefficiency plagued these efforts, they signaled a shift from endless civil strife to cautious development. Portugal was still a small, struggling nation, but it was beginning to look toward the future rather than reliving the battles of the past. A society in transition. Life in 19th century Portugal reflected these contradictions. Lisbon and Porto embraced signs of modernity. Gas lamps lit streets, railways connected towns, and newspapers debated politics fiercely. Yet in the countryside, most people lived as their ancestors had, bound to subsistence farming and the rhythms of the church. Intellectual life thrived amid the turmoil. Writers like Almeida Garrett and Alexandre Herculano shaped Portuguese Romanticism, blending history, patriotism, and cultural pride. They reminded the nation of its medieval glory, even as it struggled in the present. The legacy of the turbulent century. By the late 19th century, Portugal was far from stable, but it had survived. The monarchy endured. Constitutionalism, however, fragile took root, and society cautiously modernized. Yet the century had left deep wounds. Civil wars, political instability, and the loss of empire weighed heavily. Portugal had once ruled the seas. Now it was a small European kingdom clinging to its identity. Its empire survived in Africa and Asia, but it was weak and vulnerable. Still, the people endured with the same resilience that had carried them through centuries of struggle. The stage was set for the challenges of the 20th century, when republicanism, dictatorship, and revolution would once more shake Portugal to its foundations. But the 19th century, turbulent and bloodstained, had already tested the nation to its limits. As the 19th century waned, Portugal was weary. It had endured civil wars, ideological strife, economic stagnation, and the gradual loss of its imperial grandeur. Though the monarchy had survived, it was fragile, its legitimacy worn thin by decades of instability. A new century dawned, and with it, the stirrings of something radical. For centuries, Portugal had lived under kings and queens. Now, for the first time, the very idea of monarchy would be overthrown. The early 20th century in Portugal was an age of revolution and republicanism, a chapter in which old institutions crumbled and new ones struggled to take root. The monarchy would fall in 1910, replaced by the First Portuguese Republic, a bold experiment in democracy that promised liberty but delivered instability. This was a time of assassinations, coups, and dreams of a modern Portugal that constantly clashed with the realities of poverty, factionalism, and war. The last years of the monarchy. By the 1890s, the monarchy was in deep trouble. The economic crises that followed the loss of Brazil had never truly healed. Portugal was increasingly dependent on British loans, its industries underdeveloped, and its people mired in poverty. The empire, once a source of pride, now became a source of humiliation. In 1890, Britain issued the Ultimatum of 1890, demanding that Portugal withdraw its territorial claims in Africa between Angola and Mozambique. To the Portuguese, this was a national insult. Instead of defending Portuguese interests, King Carlos I's government capitulated. Public outrage exploded. Republicanism, once a fringe idea, now surged into mainstream politics, fueled by anger at royal weakness. King Carlos I attempted reform, but his rule was marked by scandal, corruption, and repression. His reliance on authoritarian measures alienated liberals and Republicans alike. The monarchy's foundations crumbled further. The assassination of King Carlos I's breaking point came on February 1, 1908, in Lisbon's Terreiro do Paço Square. As the royal carriage rolled through the city, two Republican conspirators opened fire. King Carlos I was killed instantly. His son and heir, Prince Luís Felipe, was also fatally shot. Only the younger son, Manuel, survived. The assassination shocked the nation. At just 18 years old, Manuel II ascended the throne. Idealistic and well-meaning, he sought to restore trust in the monarchy. But it was too late. The tide of republicanism was unstoppable. The Revolution of 1910. On October 5, 1910, the streets of Lisbon erupted. Republican activists, supported by elements of the army and navy, launched an uprising. The monarchy collapsed almost overnight. Manuel II fled into exile in England, never to return. From the balcony of Lisbon City Hall, the First Portuguese Republic was proclaimed. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and Portugal joined the wave of Republican revolutions sweeping Europe and Latin America. After centuries of monarchy, Portugal was now a republic. The First Republic, high hopes, harsh realities. The republic began with immense hope. Its leaders envisioned a Portugal reborn, modern, democratic, secular, and free from the corruption of monarchy. A new constitution was drafted, enshrining civil liberties, universal male suffrage, and a parliamentary system. The influence of the Catholic Church, long entwined with the monarchy, was sharply curtailed. Religious orders were expelled, church lands confiscated, and education secularized. But these bold reforms collided with harsh realities. Portuguese society was deeply divided. Rural peasants, still bound to tradition and faith, resisted anti-clerical measures. The military, restless and politicized, frequently intervened in politics. The economy, fragile as ever, could not sustain the grand visions of Republican leaders. Political instability. If the monarchy had been unstable, the republic was even more so. Between 1910 and 1926, Portugal endured dozens of government's cabinets rising and falling in rapid succession, sometimes lasting only weeks. Factionalism tore the Republican movement apart. The Democratic Party, led by Afonso Costa, sought aggressive anti-clericalism and centralization. Moderates pushed for more pragmatic governance. Conservatives and monarchists plotted restoration. Assassinations and coups became common. Military officers overthrew governments at will, replacing them with juntas or provisional regimes. The promise of stable democracy seemed ever out of reach. Portugal in World War I, the Republic's greatest test, came with World War I. Hoping to strengthen its international standing, Portugal joined the Allies in 1916. Portuguese troops fought bravely in Flanders and in Africa, defending colonies from German incursions. But the war strained Portugal's fragile economy to breaking point. Food shortages, inflation, and conscription bred discontent. Soldiers returned home disillusioned, and the Republic's credibility suffered further. The war that was meant to elevate Portugal instead deepened its crisis. Social struggles. The First Republic was also marked by social upheaval. Labor movements grew stronger, demanding better wages and conditions. Strikes and protests erupted in Lisbon and Porto. The urban poor, burdened by inflation, grew restless. Meanwhile, in the countryside, peasants remained impoverished, often alienated by the Republic's anti-clericalism. The gulf between city and countryside widened. Portugal seemed perpetually at war with itself, between past and future, tradition and modernity, monarchy and republic. The fall of the First Republic. By the 1920s, the First Republic had lost nearly all legitimacy. Its ideals of democracy and progress had given way to chaos and paralysis. Corruption was rampant, governments changed with dizzying frequency, and the people yearned for order. In this atmosphere, the military once again intervened. On May 28, 1926, a coup led by General Gomes da Costa marched on Lisbon. The Republic fell, replaced by a military dictatorship. From the ashes of the First Republic, a new era would begin, one that would soon solidify under the authoritarian hand of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. Legacy of the First Republic. The First Republic was short-lived, chaotic, and deeply flawed, yet it was also transformative. It ended centuries of monarchy, introduced universal male suffrage, and placed secularism at the heart of Portuguese governance. Its failures paved the way for dictatorship, but its ideals continued to inspire generations. For the Portuguese people, the years 1910 to 1926 were a whirlwind, a bold leap into republicanism, followed by bitter disillusionment. The dream of liberty remained alive, but fragile, waiting for another age to take root. When the First Republic collapsed in 1926, Portugal stood at a crossroads. The Republican dream of democracy and liberty had devolved into chaos, and the people, exhausted by decades of upheaval, longed for stability. Into this vacuum stepped the military, promising order, discipline, and a return to national greatness. But the soldiers who seized power would soon give way to a man whose shadow would stretch across nearly half a century of Portuguese history, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. From 1933 until his death in 1970, Salazar built and ruled over the Estado Novo, the new state. It was a dictatorship that cloaked itself in the language of tradition, morality, and patriotism, while silencing dissent with censorship and secret police. For generations of Portuguese, Salazar was both a fatherly figure and a suffocating presence, steering Portugal through the storms of the 20th century with an iron hand. The military coup of 1926, the First Republic had collapsed under its own weight financial crises, strikes, assassinations, and endless cabinet reshuffles. On May 28, 1926, General Gomes da Costa led a column of troops into Lisbon, overthrowing the Republic without much resistance. A military dictatorship was proclaimed. At first, it was unclear what direction this new regime would take. Portugal was still deeply in debt, its institutions fragile, and its political factions irreconcilable. What the military needed was not another general, but a man with vision, discipline, and an unshakable sense of order. They found him in an unlikely place, a quiet professor of economics from Coimbra. The rise of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar was born in 1889 in Vimeiro to a modest farming family. Reserved, deeply Catholic, and intellectually rigorous, he studied law and economics at the University of Coimbra. Unlike the fiery revolutionaries of Lisbon, Salazar preferred order to passion, discipline to chaos. In 1928, he was invited to serve briefly as Minister of Finance. At first, he declined, but when offered sweeping powers to control the budget, he accepted. Almost immediately, Salazar performed a miracle. He balanced Portugal's finances, restored confidence in government bonds, and imposed strict fiscal discipline. In a country weary of instability, his quiet efficiency stood out. By 1932, he was prime minister. 1 year later, he unveiled the Constitution of 1933, which enshrined the Estado Novo. The Estado Novo. The Estado Novo was not democracy. It was a corporatist dictatorship, inspired by conservative Catholic values and influenced by contemporary European fascist regimes. Political parties were banned, except for the regime's own national union. Parliament became little more than a rubber stamp. Censorship muzzled newspapers and literature. The secret police, the PIDE, kept watch over dissent. Salazar presented the regime as paternalistic rather than brutal. He spoke of guiding the Portuguese like children, insisting on obedience, tradition, and sacrifice. For many, especially in the conservative countryside, this message resonated. For others, particularly intellectuals, workers, and students, it was suffocating. A dictatorship in Europe. In the 1930s, Europe was swept by authoritarian regimes. Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, Hitler in Germany. Salazar's Estado Novo shared similarities but was more cautious. Unlike Hitler, Salazar avoided aggressive militarism. Unlike Mussolini, he was austere, uninterested in grandeur. Unlike Franco, he stayed out of Spain's civil war, though he quietly supported the nationalists. During World War II, Portugal remained neutral. Salazar skillfully balanced between the Allies and Axis, maintaining Portugal's independence while allowing Britain access to bases in the Azores. This neutrality spared Portugal from devastation, but also kept the regime intact when other dictatorships fell. The colonial question. If the Estado Novo was cautious at home, it was unyielding abroad. Salazar clung to the empire as the cornerstone of Portuguese identity. While other European nations began decolonizing after World War II, Salazar declared that Portugal was not an empire but a pluricontinental nation, a single entity stretching from Europe to Africa and Asia. This stubbornness would prove costly. By the 1960s, nationalist movements erupted in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. Salazar refused compromise. He sent thousands of young Portuguese men to fight in brutal colonial wars that drained the nation's resources and stained its conscience. For many Portuguese families, the war was a wound that never healed. Life under Salazar. For nearly 4 decades, life in Portugal was defined by austerity, tradition, and silence. The Estado Novo promoted a narrow vision of society: Catholic, rural, obedient. Education was limited, especially for the poor. Illiteracy remained widespread. Women were confined to traditional roles as mothers and homemakers. Workers were bound to corporatist unions controlled by the state. There were no political freedoms. Censorship ensured newspapers praised the regime, while opposition voices were silenced or exiled. The PID infiltrated universities, workplaces, and even churches, cultivating an atmosphere of fear. And yet, many Portuguese tolerated, even accepted this regime. For those who remembered the chaos of the First Republic, Salazar's Portugal offered order and predictability. Trains ran on time, debts were paid, crime was low. For the price of freedom, Salazar offered stability, opposition, and resistance. Despite repression, opposition persisted. Intellectuals and artists, such as the poet Fernando Pessoa and later writers like José Saramago, found subtle ways to critique the regime. Underground movements organized in secrecy. Students protested. Workers went on strike, often crushed by force. In the colonies, resistance was fiercer. Guerrilla movements fought Portuguese troops, drawing international condemnation. By the late 1960s, the wars in Africa consumed nearly half of Portugal's budget, dragging the nation deeper into exhaustion. The fall of Salazar. By the late 1960s, Salazar himself was an old man. In 1968, he suffered a stroke and was quietly replaced by Marcelo Caetano. But Salazar's image was so central to the regime that many Portuguese were not even told of his incapacitation. He lived the rest of his life believing he was still in power. When he died in 1970, thousands mourned him, while others quietly rejoiced. His regime, however, endured for a few more years under Caetano, but the cracks were widening. The colonial wars, economic stagnation, and growing dissent among the military would soon bring the Estado Novo crashing down. Legacy of the Estado Novo. Salazar's Portugal was paradoxical. It preserved order but stifled freedom. It kept Portugal out of global wars but trapped it in colonial conflicts. It upheld tradition but resisted modernization. For nearly half a century, the Estado Novo froze Portugal in time, isolating it from the democratic transformations sweeping Europe. Yet, its fall was inevitable. The Portuguese people, weary of repression and endless wars, yearned for change. That change would come suddenly, joyously, in the form of the Carnation Revolution of 1974, a moment when soldiers laid down their guns and filled their rifles with flowers. But before that dawn of democracy, Portugal endured nearly 50 years of dictatorship, guided by the cold, steady hand of Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. His rule remains one of the most controversial chapters in Portuguese history, seen by some as a time of order, by others as an age of suffocation. In the spring of 1974, Portugal stood on the edge of change. For nearly half a century, the Estado Novo had kept the country under the heavy hand of dictatorship. Generations had grown up in silence, watching the world modernize while Portugal clung to the past. But beneath the surface, discontent had been smoldering. The colonial wars in Africa, the stifled freedoms, the poverty of everyday life. It only needed a spark. That spark would come not from politicians, but from soldiers. The Carnation Revolution. On the morning of April 25, 1974, Lisbon awoke to the sound of marching boots and military vehicles. Soldiers loyal to the Armed Forces Movement, MFA, many of them young officers weary of endless colonial wars, took control of key points in the capital. Radio stations were seized, government buildings surrounded. The regime that had seemed immovable for decades was crumbling in hours. But this was no ordinary coup. It was astonishingly peaceful. Ordinary citizens poured into the streets, not in fear, but in joy. They offered the soldiers food, water, and, above all, flowers. Red carnations in full bloom that spring were placed into the barrels of rifles and machine guns. The image became immortal, weapons turned into vases, soldiers smiling with blossoms instead of bullets. By the end of the day, the dictatorship had fallen. Marcelo Caetano, Salazar's successor, was forced to surrender. Portugal was free. The end of empire. The revolution was not just about freedom at home, it was also about ending Portugal's costly wars abroad. Within months, the new government began negotiating independence for its colonies. Guinea-Bissau gained recognition in 1974. Mozambique and Angola achieved independence in 1975. East Timor, too, declared independence, though it would soon be invaded by Indonesia. After nearly 5 centuries, Portugal's overseas empire, once the envy of the world, was gone. The nation turned inward, facing the challenge of rebuilding itself as a modern European democracy. The turbulent transition. Freedom, however, did not bring instant stability. The years after the revolution were marked by turbulence. Political factions vied for control. Communists, socialists, moderates, and remnants of the old regime. Governments rose and fell quickly. Strikes and demonstrations swept the streets. At times, it seemed Portugal might slide into civil war. But the Portuguese people, weary of dictatorship, refused to surrender their newfound liberty. Through compromise, debate, and persistence, they built a new order. In 1976, a new democratic constitution was adopted, guaranteeing civil liberties, free elections, and a multi-party system. For the first time in its history, Portugal stood as a modern democracy. The European-turned democracy opened the door to Europe. For centuries, Portugal had been tied to its empire. Now it sought integration with its neighbors. In 1986, Portugal joined the European Economic Community, later the EU. Funds from Brussels helped modernize infrastructure, from highways to schools. Trade expanded, industries developed, and Portuguese workers gained opportunities abroad. Europe became not just a partner, but a lifeline, helping Portugal transition from a poor, isolated nation into a member of the modern European family. Social transformation. With democracy came profound changes in Portuguese society. Education expanded and literacy rates soared. Healthcare improved, raising life expectancy and lowering infant mortality. Women gained rights once denied to them under the Estado Novo, taking their place in politics, business, and culture. The rigid Catholic order loosened. Portugal became more open, diverse, and cosmopolitan. Lisbon and Porto blossomed into vibrant cities, blending centuries of history with modern energy. Rural villages once trapped in poverty saw new opportunities as roads, electricity, and services reached them. Challenges and crises. The journey was not without hardship. Portugal faced economic crises, political scandals, and waves of emigration as young people sought better opportunities abroad. The financial crash of 2008 hit hard, leading to austerity measures and public protests. Many feared history might repeat itself, yet Portugal endured. Its democracy held firm. The people who had toppled a dictatorship without firing a shot were not about to give up their freedom. Slowly, the economy recovered, and new industries, tourism, technology, renewable energy took root. Portugal today. Today, Portugal stands as a testament to resilience. From a tiny medieval kingdom clinging to the edge of Europe, it became a global empire. From dictatorship, it emerged into democracy. Its story is not one of easy triumph, but of constant struggle, adaptation, and survival. Lisbon's cobbled streets echo with centuries of history, yet buzz with the energy of youth and innovation. The memory of the Carnation Revolution is honored every April 25th as flowers once again fill the streets. Portugal's writers, artists, and musicians, from José Saramago to Amália Rodrigues, continue to share its soul with the world. Though small in size, Portugal carries a legacy vast in influence. Explorers who mapped the seas, poets who captured longing, revolutionaries who showed the world that even dictatorships can be felled with flowers. The spirit of the carnations. If there is one thread that ties Portugal's history together, it is resilience. From the struggles against Moorish rule to the voyages that spanned oceans, from the long nights of dictatorship to the dawn of democracy, Portugal has always endured. The Carnation Revolution remains its most poetic moment, a reminder that freedom, once seized, can bloom like a flower, fragile yet powerful, simple yet transformative. It was a revolution that proved guns need not roar, that courage can be peaceful, and that even the smallest flower can topple the tallest fortress. Closing reflection. The story of Portugal is the story of a people who never gave up on themselves. A people who, despite poverty, invasion, repression, and loss, always found a way to sing, to hope, to fight, and to endure. From the medieval castles of the Reconquista to the modern boulevards of Lisbon, the Portuguese journey is one of transformation, resilience, and hope. And as the sun sets over the Tagus River, casting its golden light on the city that has seen it all, one truth remains. Portugal may be small, but its history is vast, and its spirit unbreakable.